welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. This is a JFK panel. I think this is the fifth one I've done. It's been about a year since I did the last one, but this episode is largely going to focus on the media representation before, during, and after the Kennedy assassination. Obviously, as everyone in this group here is JFK researchers that all have their own perspective and viewpoint on the assassination and how either difficulties it was or these troubling things to them that came up in the assassination that caused them to focus in a specific area. But we're going to be largely focused on the media. And as in media, I mean the media companies and also reporters, because there's a balance between conspiracy and there's a balance between the official narrative. There are some things that are largely chalked up to just misreporting, which we'll talk about later in this episode. But obviously, there is an official narrative out there, and it seems like the ones that get well publicized, get the backed funding and everything like that, happens to do with the official narrative. So, guys, I wanted to talk about the before reporting on obviously JFK. There's always this idea, and I think there's a lot of evidence to it, but Kennedy was not well received in Dallas, at least when it came to his arrival there. He was warned by others not to go there, and there was a lot of things that were kind of circulating in the press that either weren't good for Kennedy or very critical of Kennedy, and I would like to get you guys' viewpoints on it. Now, there's 5 other people in here, so let's start off Paul, Randy, Rich, Scott, and Brad, if you guys need help. And then obviously we'll free flow jumping through. But Paul, would you like to start?
Yeah, I would just say that Kennedy's looming trip to Dallas in November 1963, he wasn't looking forward to it. That's well known. It was. It wasn't a part of his re-election for 1964. Well, not technically, but it was definitely with that firmly in mind. Obviously needed to go there and very much mend fences, I think the term was back then. Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, wasn't any good with helping out with the beef between Yarber and Connolly. So it was very much a trip of necessity. And of course, Adlai Stevenson had his troubles. He'd been set upon by a crowd a couple of months before. So he wasn't looking forward to the trip. It had been planned out a few months in advance. I think it was the middle of September that it was announced, but he certainly wasn't looking forward to it. And of course, that time, that lead up time, of course, gave the right wing elements in Dallas a good period of time to get very stirred up by his visit.
Which is very interesting because if you look at the reporting or oral histories of people that were alive when the Kennedy was assassinated, they always talked about that there was that Adlai Stevenson event. There was that issue with Dallas there, and Dallas was going to have a bad name. I was like, do you guys care that somebody was killed in your state, or do you just care that you guys are going to have a kind of a bad reputation? Which obviously it became called the City of Hate. Randy?
Yeah, well, actually, I think this is right down Rich's alley. He wrote the great book Deep State in the Heart of Texas. But Paul's exactly right. It was a state that he needed, and I think other guys, y'all might be able to correct me on this, but he wasn't thrilled having. He never really wanted LBJ as vice president. And so a lot of that was coercion, getting him into places where he wasn't popular. And I'd like to just toss this to Rich.
Oh, you're going to give me your time.
Yes.
Thanks. Taking notes here.
I about to say, at least you're
first of all,
taking some notes on some of this stuff.
Yeah, I want to keep track of who says what, especially the things I want to respond to. Yeah, Randy's correct. LBJ was going to be dumped from the ticket. It was time to get the campaign going. There was no way JFK was going to miss this trip. It's a pervasive myth. You know all the pervasive myths out there. The driver shot JFK, Marilyn Monroe, all that. People totally believe that stuff. That's like truth in their minds. They also believe that Kennedy against his will, was going on this chore trip to nut country to mend fences and to stop feuding in Texas. Not so. Absolutely not true. You got to read George Michael Evica's brilliant workshop that he gave in 1993 at the ASK conference. I have the full transcript. I have the tape somewhere. You can still probably get the tape from Lancer. I don't know. But I have the full transcript. I transcribed it myself by hand, every word. It's on my Substack. It's 2 parts. It's so long, it's 2 parts. But it covers so much about that trip before, during, and after, and how they manipulated it, how Connally controlled the trip, the selection of the speech site, and which determined the motorcade route. All of that was pre-done. It started in April of 63. The purpose of going started in April 63. A group of men here in Texas, the Knights of San Jacinto, which is a subgroup, an elite subgroup of the Sons of the Republic of Texas, which is like, everybody's heard of the Daughters of the Revolution, which is the American Revolution. We have the sons and daughters of the Texas Revolution. And, it's like having ancestry from the Mayflower. If you're there, you can only get in if your ancestry in Texas goes back to the actual revolutionary period and the Republic. Well, not the Republic, but the Revolution. My ancestry goes back to the Republic, but not the Revolution. Just missed it. I'm 7th generation. If I was 8th generation, I would be in. Not that I would want to be, because people like Jack Valenti were on this Knights of San Jacinto. And it's those guys that they were Connally's men back then. Well, they had gravitated over to LBJ since LBJ became vice president, sort of on loan from Connally, but they started out with Connally. And they set up they came up with a reason that JFK would not refuse. He was a busy guy. He had a lot of things going on. Even when he started the campaign, he had a lot of things going on. They came up with a dinner to honor a guy that Kennedy thought was his friend, a good friend, Albert Thomas, a congressman from Texas, Houston, the guy responsible for putting NASA, the Johnson Space Flight Center, in Houston. Very powerful congressman. And and it turns out that he had been diagnosed with cancer, so he wasn't going to be around much longer. And they wanted to have this dinner honoring him for all that he had done for Texas, for the country, for JFK. And there was no way JFK was going to say no to this. So they had the perfect thing. So they set up the dinner, and guess what? In late April, specifically like right around San Jacinto Day, which is what they meet annually for that battle anniversary, around April 21st, they set the date for November 21st. Now, remember that, months in advance, late April of 1963, the date is set, and it never changes. So they have all year to plan this thing. Now, it does, expand, and it gets consolidated, and they add things, they subtract things from the trip. All of this negotiation is going on, but Connally is controlling it. And so my point is, there's no way JFK is going to say no to this. He's going, and he's going to be there in November 21st, at least, in Houston for the dinner to honor Albert Thomas. Now it expands. They add Dallas. Go ahead.
I was going to say, can I just play devil's advocate here and just say it's probably multifactorial? Obviously, there's I've heard 5 different reasons why LBJ was even on the ticket. So, and I don't know which one could be true. I think some people go, Monica Wiesik says that Bobby or RFK, JFK just handed it out to him, didn't actually think he'd accept it, just as a sign of good sportsmanship. Okay, Rich obviously doesn't believe that one. And then there's another one. There's plenty of different reasons why he was on the ticket. It could be multifactorial. So I don't think Paul was incorrect in his statement that it was about mending fences. There could be multiple reasons you can go anywhere. We just got to accept that. And it helps us narrow down all these theories. Because like if you talk about the big connections in Dallas, we've done discussions about Harold Byrd, who owned the TSBD. We've done connections with LBJ and the deep politics of things. There's many reasons that, there could be a reason why JFK would have went to Dallas. The issue is that that was a danger zone for him. And I mean, did he know it at the time? The media wasn't very receptive on him there, but you bring up a very good point, Rich. You start explaining certain instances where LBJ and Connolly, like a lot of people don't know about that relationship. They were very good friends. A lot of people don't realize that. Actually, I'll pull something up real quick. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this before, but it's from one of LBJ's home movies. So look who's in this photograph. There's LBJ. Who's that right there? That's Governor Connolly. They're at Christmas at his house. So, I mean, it's a very strange tape. It's weird. You get to see somebody dressed up in a Santa Claus suit. It's not LBJ. I already looked. It's not LBJ. But there's obviously relationships and deeper things that go down to this kind of Texas pride and heart of Texas. That is very important to be talking about as well, too, especially when you're examining the assassination. But what about what the reception for when Kennedy got there was? I think a lot of people, we see photographs, especially my generation, looking back at an event. If we're not digging through video footage or we don't have any archival footage to look at, we're examining a lot of photographs. And Kennedy seems well liked. He seems loved by everybody. So anybody that wants to pick up the ending of that, feel free.
Well, Kennedy was a superstar everywhere he went. It's not like today. He was a superstar worldwide. Anywhere he went, everyone was super, super excited. Dallas was very excited. In fact, one of the reporters, talking about the media, one of the reporters, I've got his name here. He was reporting from Maine and Akron, Bob Huffaker, Dallas Morning News, no, KRLD. And he said it looked like the entire city of Dallas came out. Everybody was out there. They were excited. And, Nellie Connolly's famous for saying, you can't say that Dallas doesn't love you anymore. When they were at the end of the trip, she said that on Elm Street. That's true. Dallas was glad that he was there. Only the fringe elements, the extreme right wing, the ones who killed him, they were the only ones who hated him with a passion. And they were the ones who wanted to kill him, the ones that got him there. And he wasn't there to mend fences, as you'll see when you read Evica's workshop. The polls were saying he was going to win 64. It's early yet, so who knows? But he was confident. Everybody was confident. There were no indications that he was going to lose. He was extremely popular politically. He was going there as a victory march. The conservative element of the Texas Democratic Party was on its way out. LBJ was on his way out. There was a big Life magazine article that was going to expose their crimes just the week after the assassination. It was scheduled to come out. The Bobby Baker scandal. There was also the Billy Saul Estes thing. And all of their crimes, all their political crimes were about to hit because Bobby Kennedy had been investigating this in the Justice Department. And so they were not only on their way out in politics, they were on their way to jail on that weekend. And of course, Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was in the motorcade, in LBJ's car, by the way, they tried to get him into the limousine, but Kennedy would have none of that because it wasn't protocol. And so he ended up in the car with LBJ. And Yarborough was their hated enemy. He was the liberal senator. And that was rare in Texas. But Yarborough was very smart. He knew how to get elected. And he did it the way Lloyd Doggett does it today. We have a liberal senator here, liberal representative here, Lloyd Doggett. And he learned from Yarborough how to stay elected in Texas. And he's been a representative in Congress for a long time because he found those little niches. Anytime they rearrange the district, he goes into the new district and campaigns all over again. And that's the way Yarborough did it. They hated Yarborough, is what I'm saying. And so Yarborough was with Kennedy. Kennedy was liberal. Yarborough was liberal. Connally and Johnson represented the right-wing element of the Democratic Party, which you have to understand Texas politics to know that Texas was always a red state. It was never Democratic. It was always red Democratic. The post-Civil War Democrats were today's Republicans and vice versa. That's what Texas was and is today.
So
We're
are you
still
saying that you
struggling.
don't think LBJ had any boost to Kennedy's numbers in Dallas?
In the beginning, you could probably make an argument that, yeah, they wanted LBJ, Texas wanted LBJ on the ticket. So, yeah, and Texans are very insecure, first of all. They call it proud, but they brag because they're insecure. I'm a lifelong Texan, 7 generations, so I can diss Texas. And I've studied Texas politics, the whole history of it. I have an essay called Deep Party Politics, which is all about that. But yeah, LBJ, they wanted LBJ in the White House. And of course, LBJ wanted to be in the White House too. And his brother told us, Sam Johnson told us that, yeah, he wasn't stupid enough to become vice president, which had been called about as good as a warm bowl of spit. And LBJ knew this. He knew everything about politics. He wanted in the White House because he knew that Kennedy's health was not all that great.
All right, just remember, this is a conversation about the media, not about LBJ. So,
yeah, right. So, okay. So LBJ's on the ticket because he wanted to be on the ticket, and they actually forced their way onto the ticket. And as far as the media, there were reports in even the Dallas papers that morning that he was going to be dumped from the ticket. They asked Nixon about it. Nixon was quoted on that because Nixon was there. He flew out of left field that morning. And so that was in the papers. Yeah, they were not only out politically, the conservative element of the Texas Democratic Party, they were about to go to jail. And it was over for them. And it was a victory parade for the liberal Democrats in Texas.
Scott, do you want to explain some of the media in JFK?
I think I would just add, so can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, I think what I've just going to add, I mean, I was thinking about, General Walker again, because, I mean, General Walker, when he resigned from the army, could have went anywhere. I mean, he was a Texan, but he could have based himself anywhere, but he based himself in Dallas. And he spent most of his time after then, kind of riling people up. And I think he went to Dallas because there was a right-wing element already based in the city. They might have been a minority, but I think they were a kind of large minority and a very vocal minority. And I think that, like, the Dallas Morning News probably, almost went without a day, an editorial criticizing JFK and his policies, and he was soft on communism, etc. I think the incident that Paul mentioned at the Dallas auditorium, where Stevenson was, heckled and then hit over the head with a placard, and Walker had actually had a demonstration there the day before. He called it US Day, whereas Stevenson was there at UN Day, and that was deliberately to provoke and antagonize. We also had the wanted for treason leaflets that were passed around Dallas in the days leading up to Kennedy's visit, and of course the Dallas Morning News ran the advert, "Welcome, Mr. Kennedy," that criticised Kennedy from top of the page to the bottom of the page. So I think in terms of in Dallas, I'm pretty sure when people were picking up newspapers in the run up to Kennedy's visit, they were reading lots of negative editorials, negative stories about Kennedy, and of course that there were some violent incidents. I think Walker as well was, sorry, not Walker, Johnson was attacked with his wife as well. Was it maybe 1960? Was it the mink coat mob? So Dallas had a reputation at the time fairly or unfairly, that is what it had. And I do think, Kennedy must have had, whether it is in the back of his mind or in the front of his mind, some real concerns about going to Dallas, particularly after what happened to Adlai Stevenson. But as others have said, I mean, he was warmly welcomed. The whole city was almost out there to greet him, but there was still that very vocal and dangerous minority that didn't welcome him there at all.
Brad?
How do you follow all these great gentlemen's remarks? I would just comment that if you look at him in Fort Worth that morning, I don't know what news coverage was in Fort Worth prior to his arrival. When he was at that Chamber of Commerce meeting, he was relaxed. He joked. He was the John Kennedy that everybody knew. And then there's the story, and I believe it's true, but it may be apocryphal, that during the flight over from Fort Worth into Dallas, he had noted the welcome Mr. President or welcome Mr. Kennedy to Dallas had, and he remarked to somebody, Dave Powers or Kenny O'Donnell or somebody, we're really headed into nut country. I think he had anticipated it being a lot more hostile based on the news coverage that he had seen. But then, as you pointed out, when they get into that motorcade, it was the whole of Dallas that turned out. I think they thought they were going to get out of there without any problem, in spite of the media. It almost seemed like when you look at that Welcome Mr. Kennedy ad, that that was designed to whip up sentiment against the trip.
I'm just going to boost your point here, Brad. This is one thing I always found really
and that's really all I've got, Robbie. Go ahead and do that, and then you can go to somebody else.
So this was what I always thought was very interesting when Kennedy was in Dallas. Actually, if you watch this whole Chamber of Commerce video, when everyone stands up and takes a bow, and this is before Jackie Kennedy even arrives in here, everyone is very excited in the crowd for LBJ to stand up, Connolly to stand up. They went nuts, a bunch of people. But then when Kennedy stands up, you just kind of see the reporters taking pictures. You see a few people standing up. It's not the same reaction. But this was always weird about this video to me, is where they greeted.
Fields, you have brought sunshine in our hearts. No, we know that you don't wear a hat. We couldn't let you leave Fort Worth without providing you with some protection against the rain.
Put it on in the White House on Monday. If you'll come up there, you'll have a chance to see it then.
Very conjovial, it's very friendly, joking sense. But you feel that little tense cut in the air when he went to go put the hat on. Everyone was like a pause, pin drop, silence, and then next thing you know, he didn't put it on. You hear everybody go, "Aw." I don't know. For me, it's much like what Rich was talking about with the inner group or whatever you want to call it, the Freemason version of the Texas Brotherhood, whatever you want to say. I mean, it was a sign that, you're Texan, wearing those giant hats. Bill Decker was the one that had all of his men during the whole motorcade and obviously afterwards that were identified by wearing those giant white hats. That was a thing. Even Herschel Jacks in his statement talked about that hat was given to him to wear because he was part of the public safety thing, but he was driving LBJ's car. So there was obviously this sense of like Texas pride, and you can identify that or put that into an object, and that would be a hat. But I mean, to me, that video was always interesting because I always found it weird, the crowd's reaction, because we all know Kennedy for loving his hair. I mean, I doubt he would wear any hat from any city, but this is obviously a moment, it seems like, for the crowd, and obviously that can be speculation or connecting the lines, but it's just an interesting video. And then another point to what Brad was talking about is when we talk about things that were going around Dallas at the time when Kennedy arrived, we have this right here, just the Welcome Mr. Kennedy ad to Dallas. So obviously, got this giant. Hold on, sorry. I'm new to this, guys, so be careful. It's gonna take me a little bit of time here. Welcome, Mr. Kennedy added Dallas, and it says a city is disgraced, and well, I can only read them. Mr. Kennedy, despite contentions of part of the administrations in the State Department, the mayor of Dallas, the Dallas City Council, and members of the party, we free-thinking and American-thinking citizens of Dallas still have, through a constitution largely ignored by you, the right to address our grievances, to question you, to disagree with you, and to criticize you. And asserting in this constitutional right, we wish to ask you publicly the following questions, indeed questions of paramount importance and interest to all free peoples everywhere, which we trust you will answer in public without sophistry. These questions are, and then it explains a lot about why is Latin America turning either anti-American or communistic or both, despite increased U.S. foreign aid, State Department policy, and just, I mean, every president has had serious questions posed to them, but this was one of the articles that a lot of people mention when it comes to the reception in Dallas. Now, this is a free question. Anybody want to respond back to that? That's fine. So don't.
I'm just going to say, if I don't, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but the American Fact-Finding Committee, who basically, they're at the bottom of that advert, were really just a kind of made up company for the purposes of producing that advert. I think it was that Bernard Wiseman was the guy that placed the advert, but it makes it sound like there's some grandiose group of people called the American Fact-Finding Committee, when in fact they didn't really exist, and it was just that one individual who placed the advert. So they were certainly very keen to get that full page out there, and I think the Dallas Morning News would have been more than happy to have obliged, which of course they did.
And that's obviously mentioned throughout testimonies that happen to deal with Ruby, when he talks about how either someone encountered Ruby who was upset about an article that was published about Kennedy, which I think if some of us would have researched the Ruby stuff, we would have came across a lot of that kind of sentiment that Ruby had this admiration for President Kennedy. But I've seen kind of both sides, where he didn't ever talk about politics or he talked about politics. So I guess it was just who you met.
Well, he loved Kennedy that much that he allegedly didn't actually go out and look at the motorcade. He was in the Dallas Morning News, putting his advert together.
Building,
so
yeah.
If he loved Kennedy so much, and Jackie Kennedy, you would have thought he'd be out on the street, waving at them and saying, hi.
Ruby was probably more taken with the impeach or Warren billboard over near Stemmons Freeway, and he had little pocket postcard sized versions of that flyer found on him, apparently after he shot Oswald. So I think he was probably more taken with that publication.
So there's clearly a lot of people that were excited to see JFK come to Dallas, but there's obviously some murmurs of sentiment that were not very positive towards JFK before. And I think JFK, from Monica Weisick's work, he was like the first person ever first president to do largely the most amount of television time, used the television as a platform to really boost with his speeches, because he believed that the media was taking him out of context and only using bits and pieces of things that he would say. And he was tired of the criticism, so he figured that he'd give the public a good, full, however extended amount of time of him actually talking and speaking without stopping, and really have this kind of connection with the audience, which I think was important, because we all know about JFK's speeches and how impactful they were. And then even with how many people watched on their televisions, either certain speeches or things when we talk about going to the moon. I mean, it's very impactful, as much as Walter Cronkite coming on air and telling us that Kennedy was killed. A lot of people remember it just like that. So
the way he worked the crowd in the ballroom there at the hotel in Fort Worth, he had them in the palm of the hand, and there was that awkwardness there, that hush across the crowd, but they worked that crowd as well as he would any other time. The anticipation of whether he'd put the hat on or not, he was milking that for all it was worth. He was obviously a master.
Now, anybody else have anything else to add to the early reporting on the JFK assassination? Because obviously the meat and potatoes is going to be that during part.
Scott mentioned the placard incident with Adlai Stevenson in the hotel, which was 2 weeks before the trip to Dallas. That too has been built up in the press as a near riot. It wasn't. If you look into that incident, you read the stories at the time. It was a minor incident, and it's almost like a lady with a placard kind of stumbled in the crowd and fell over, and then there was a little scuffle, and then it passed. But it turns out that the people holding the placards were part of that like fringe, tiny group of right wingers who hated Kennedy, hated liberalism, and what grew into MAGA today started as this like little fringe group. And whenever they popped up their little heads in anywhere around a major event, around a major political figure, it got press, but in the sense that, oh, look at these silly right wingers doing their little shtick again. And that's all the placard incident was. It was a minor incident, but it's been played up as a near right in the press, in the media, because it helps their narrative. You have to look at the mainstream narrative since the assassination and use it as a negative barometer for the truth. So when you're talking about there's 5 versions of everything, the one you can almost certainly not go with is the one the major media promoted and built up after the assassination.
I don't want to do this the whole time, but half correct and half right you are, Rich. If you actually examine the light touch she did.
On October 24th,
right here in the glasses
Adlai
off to the
Stevenson
left.
was hit by placards wielded by Walker's more aggressive
She did that
followers.
purposefully and then made a little comment as she walked away. You can see that. So I just want to make sure, if you notice.
Aggressive followers.
Hold on 1 second.
Yeah, people. I think he was spat on as well.
Hit by placards wielded by Walker's
She
more
did that on purpose and then said something as she did it. I wouldn't say that's hyped up press. And yes, that is one person that did that. And I have heard accounts of him being spit on. So half right and half correct, or half right and half wrong. It obviously was one person. It wasn't a whole group sea of people attacking it. I'm sure the press hyped it up like they usually do, which we'll be discussing about the during the assassination part as well too. But she made a comment too.
Can I just, sorry, Robert, just to add there that whilst I hear what Richard's saying, and you don't want to blow these events into more than what they are, but it wasn't something that happened a lot elsewhere in the States. It happened in Dallas. Walker and his allies had stirred people up big time. They made sure they were in the auditorium heckling Stevenson. They made sure they were outside the auditorium, causing as much as trouble as they could. So I don't mean to, exaggerate its importance, but, it was something that happened very close to the assassination in the city where the assassination happened. And similar events didn't happen that much around the States. So I think it is a significant event.
Well, there's a significant amount of people that wanted to go see the motorcade and were standing on the street watching the motorcade in hopes to get a glimpse of President Kennedy, whether it's for their kids or whether it was for them. A lot of people, we found out about home footage later, which we'll talk about more about the media reporting during the assassination. But there was obviously a lot of people that were just at work and didn't see anything at all. They didn't have an interest in going to see the presidential motorcade. So it was an event that was coming to Dallas, and I think there's both kind of pros and people that didn't really care at all when it came to Kennedy's reception there. So,
Robbie, what I meant was the Stevenson incident, not the Kennedy.
I know I'm just explaining an overall kind of discussion
Yeah.
here about the assassination because we're spending a lot of time picking apart each other's comments on it. Let's move into the during part of the Kennedy assassination. Obviously, this is kind of the meat and potatoes of the episode because we've all looked at how media completely dropped the ball. And now the question is, was that ball dropped purposefully? Or was it dropped just accidentally? And I think a lot of us, or most of us, or all of us agree that it was dropped purposefully. Media completely dropped the ball on this one, probably with orders from whoever to do so. And if you examine more about those connections, and I want to ask you guys, because I asked you guys before to have some examples of either media reporting on the assassination, good or bad. There obviously is some articles that did talk about the assassination in a less main narrative way, which we can discuss. But largely those articles were focused onto Oswald, not so much focused onto actually Kennedy. It's like my biggest issue with Eisenhower, which the beef we didn't never talk about, but the beef before with Eisenhower and JFK making comments at each other. There is, when Kennedy died, there is a bunch of people that made statements. Richard Nixon has a very weird one where it's like, dude, just what do you, now he talks weird, so you kind of can't blame him for that, but he was very awkward in that. But Eisenhower, throughout his whole message about President Kennedy's death, never once mentioned John F. Kennedy. He said the president. He referred to as the president. And he said that this is a tarnish, and the American public needs to have faith in their government, and we need to look at the president as like a kind of like a holy position. Now he mentions Miss Kennedy, and then he mentions where he's going to be later on that evening, and that he's canceled his weekend plans at his cabin because of this incident, but never actually focuses on the remorse for John F. Kennedy, which people can take for that what it is. But to me, that was always weird. But let's talk about our opinions and perspectives on during the assassination, the reporting about what was going on.
Well, I'd probably just start by saying that what reporters actually witnessed it, because wasn't the press boss so far back in the motorcade, further back than normal? So you talk about kind of how the press were put in a position to not report, not observe what had taken place, and I think that's because they were literally positioned further back in the motorcade than normal.
Yeah, and not necessarily during, but maybe we'll get to this. But once a lot of my film is based on the Zapruder film immediately after, right? And so when you talk about whether it was orders or self-preservation or trying to further one's career, it doesn't get any worse than the way Dan Rather reported having seen the Zapruder film. He and others had a private screening of the Zapruder film. I believe it was in Zapruder's office. And he ran back to WFAA, where he was a cub reporter, and immediately reported that you could see the president's head being blasted dramatically forward. And that's not what the film showed, yet that was the very first piece of information that major media reported. You guys got to remember, too, that immediately following the assassination, those first-generation researchers, Penn Jones, Shirley Martin from Oklahoma, Mary Farrell, started collecting all the newspapers they could. And those first reports echoed what people on the ground were saying. Shots came from the front, shots came from the back, shots came from high to the back, shots came from other directions. So, and I think it was like 78% of the people in Dealey Plaza reported to local newspapers that shots came from the front, or maybe even 80. But those first news accounts in the papers that those first-generation reporters, first-generation researchers collected, all pointed to more than one shooter, pointed to conspiracy. But it wasn't until Dan Rather really put that out into the major media that that the real narrative started.
I actually watched a bit of that last night, Randy, knowing that I suspected Dan Rather's name was going to come up at some point, and yeah, I watched it again. His talking to camera about Kennedy's head moved violently forward. He even mentioned about the motorcade as it turned onto Elm. Just the assassin was just in the window above. Everything that he was saying was he was on message. I think at that point, it has to be Oswald. It has to be the 6th floor, because he was even referring to the building, the window where the assassin was located, in his eyes. And when you see the Zapruder film and you see it alongside, Rather's, kind of explanation or account of it, it's just ludicrous. I mean, he would probably argue he only saw it once, but I don't know how you can interpret the headshot as being lunged violently forward. It's just ridiculous. Yeah, that was it.
The assassin was waiting. About 35 yards past the very base of the building, just below the window, President Kennedy could be seen to put his right hand up to the side of his head to either brush back his hair or perhaps rub his eyebrow. President Kennedy was sitting on the same side of the car as the building from which the shot came. Mrs. Kennedy was by his side. In the jump seat in front of him, Mrs. Connolly and Governor Connolly. Governor Connolly on the same side of the car as the president, and in the front seat, 2 Secret Service men. Just as the president put that right hand up to the side of his head, you could see him lurch forward. The first shot had hit him.
I'm muted now. Is that someone that was just not, maybe hadn't even seen the footage at all and was just looking at frames or photos or something like that? Because we obviously know the issue with Life magazine when they reported and they did their first kind of retraction, which is that the frames were printed out of sequence to show that the shot went forward. I mean, I'm not trying to rationalize the conspiracy side of things at all. I do believe that there's a lot of conspiracy here with the media, but I'm just bringing up another point.
I think he did see the video. Sorry, you go, Randy. Sorry.
I know. Go ahead.
Yeah, he definitely did see the video. It was in the Zapruder's lawyer's office, so he did see it. He probably only saw it once, and the Zapruder film doesn't last too long. But and then he ran off to, tell people what he had seen. But I watched as well. There were some more recent interviews with Dan Rather, and people are asking him about the Zapruder film, but they never challenge him on that particular statement about the head moving violently forward. And I don't know if that's just another sign of the media, just playing along, because he's never really been, I don't feel, sufficiently challenged on that statement, because that really did, and because the Zapruder film wasn't seen by the American people for over, 12 years or so, his account would have stuck with them, until they actually got to see it for themselves on Goodnight America.
That's another thing that's very important that I'm sure we all have opinions on. But what newspaper organization or magazine would find the most historical film, buy it, and then seal it away for so long? You'd think that they would want to get the #1 scoop on it. I mean, this was an issue with one of the reporters that I think worked for either KRLD or KBox that was fired shortly after the assassination because he was in the studio when the assassination happened and left one of the microphones open, where apparently they shared an office with AP News, and AP was able just to pick off their report and report on it almost at the exact same time. And the whole point was to get a leg up on the other news station. That's why we have a lot of speculation and certain things like that, which I have some examples I'll show a little bit later on. But why would they seal the Zapruder film if it wasn't somebody told them to or made some type of deal? And we obviously know, or a lot of us are aware of Operation Mockingbird, but it wasn't until Geraldo Rivera came out and showed the American public the Zapruder film with Robert Groden, that it opened up a lot of people's minds. Like, the head didn't go forward. The head went back and to the left.
Yeah. Rava had said that he'd been sent back to the lawyer's office with like a £10,000 offer for the Zapruder film, and I think Time had already outbid it. They'd bid over, I think he said $50,000. So the film was with them. And I was thinking that as well, Robbie, last night about, you've got this film, you've paid in those days, it's a lot of money in these days, but it's a massive amount back in 1963. They've got the film and they lock it away in a vault and they don't let anybody see it. And yet the backyard photographs that come into their possession, whether you believe that they are real or faked, they're very quick to have them printed on the front of Life magazine. So they had an agenda from the get-go. I think that it had to be, it was Oswald, it was a lone assassin, and it was probably the Mockingbird influence that was leading them down that way. Because if they've got something they can show that in the public's eyes that Oswald was the assassin, they'll put it out there. If they've got something to show that would cast doubt on that, they'll lock it away in a vault.
Brad, I haven't heard from you yet. Oh, I'm sorry, Randy.
Oh, no, it's just real quick. It's important to remember that the Hoover's letter to Bobby Kennedy on the late afternoon of the 22nd stated unequivocally that that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone and there was no conspiracy. So the official story started hours later before any investigation had even started. So when we think about where that story started and who started running with it, it started that afternoon. And I can't imagine all the newspapers, all the magazines, especially Saturday Evening Post and Time Life and New York Times and the Washington Post, were all really in line from throughout World War II with the official story. And whatever that official story might have been, and it just continued from the OSS to the CIA and to the military-industrial complex.
Brad,
and so it's not surprising that they all didn't step in sequence.
Brad, I haven't heard about your opinion on the Zapruder film yet.
The Zapruder film, I think part of the reason that was sealed up was that Time Life was not a multimedia company at that time. They really didn't have a way to get that out. And in those days, you got to remember that you didn't see gory pictures in the 60s. Everything would have been fuzzed out. If I might touch upon something related but slightly different, an hour after Kennedy was declared dead, Malcolm Perry, who was in charge of treatment at Parkland Hospital, and Kemp Clark, who was the neurosurgeon, they did go to a classroom and give a press conference wherein they stated essentially that President Kennedy, they thought, had been shot likely from the front. That did get some traction and was printed that day, and I believe into the next day. And of course, as Mr. Randolph was pointing out, or Mr. Benson was pointing out, the official story had started within hours, and this was in direct contradiction. So what happens? The Secret Service shows up at Parkland Hospital on Sunday and says, "Hey, you guys are not to talk about this anymore." So aside from the Zapruder film, which I know is what you asked me about, but I think this is important. The guys at Parkland who had no agenda, who had no instructions, who had no official story, they were just giving their observations, and that story started to kind of creep out yet that day.
Rich?
Well, I have a few things to say about Dan Rather.
Now, is it about
Zapruder film?
Okay, so it's about during the assassination. Remember, it's media during the assassination.
Well, we're talking about Dan Rather running back to the studio, and we saw the clip. And that's what he did. That was on Monday. I had to dig into this because Erwin Schwartz, my wife's uncle, whose favorite chair I'm sitting in right now, he always said Dan Rather is a liar. He read Dan Rather's book, The Camera Never Blinks. And from that moment on, Erwin Schwartz told everybody he knew that Dan Rather is a damn liar. So I had to dig into this, and I had to understand what was going on with Dan Rather and the Zapruder film. Well, I wrote a short, prints out to 3 pages called Z Film Red Frame White Light. It's on my Substack. Go into all the details of this. And it turns out that he did see it in Sam Passman's office on Monday. He's vague about dates in his book. So a lot of people interpreted that as he was one of the guys in the press that were there on Saturday. Erwin ran the projector all the times that was shown to the press that weekend. He said Dan Rather that was why he called Rather a liar. He said Dan Rather wasn't in the room. But on Monday in Sam Passman's office, Dan Rather had a chance to see the film, and then he ran back before he could forget anything and told the public what he saw. What I found out in looking at, getting my head around the film itself, and this goes into why they suppressed it for 12 years. There was a shell game that went on with that film that weekend that involved Erwin Schwartz and Ed Zapruder. And you track their chronology and what they say and what happened. And I've got my full transcript that Noel Twyman and I did with Erwin Schwartz available. And it turns out that what Dan Rather saw, they hadn't had they were busy at the Rochester CIA secret photographic room in Rochester, New York, and all the shenanigans going on between Rochester and DC and the briefing boards and all that. They were altering the film that weekend. But there's no way they had it ready to go and in Sam Passman's hands on Monday. What Dan Rather saw, I figured out, was an original copy of the film that was made on Friday evening. Now, it could have been a bootleg. Who knows? There were bootlegs floating around. Most likely, Zapruder's personal lawyer, Sam Passman, had a legitimate copy of the film in his hands on Monday. And that's what Dan Rather saw. It's the only thing he could have seen. There's no way he could have seen the altered versions that were being done in DC. And so what if he was telling the truth? We have to think in terms of what if Dan Rather was telling the truth? Because I found out that everything about Connolly's movements at that moment, that the shots were being fired, everything about Connolly's movements were removed at frame 227. And my entire essay is about frame 227. I'm absolutely convinced that they edited the film at that point to remove the shot to Connolly, because that would have blown the whole thing wide open. And so I have to ask a legitimate question: what if Dan Rather is telling the truth? And it's only absurd. What he says is only absurd because it's not what we see in the film today. I think Dan Rather's statements is evidence of an altered film.
I think,
and that's why they did it for 12 years.
Well, I think with Rather, you even have him in a PBS special when he's showing a reporter, and he goes, "What do you think? Where do you think the head goes?" And the guy, immediately, without even waiting, just says, "It looks like it goes back and to the left." And then Rather says this, and this is where I can only find that this has ever created this theory about Jackie did it. And he said, "Well, you don't know. Jackie could have, in the commotion, pushed Kennedy backward." So he said that in the PBS special. I don't remember if it's called The Continuing Inquiry or something of that sort. It's something along those lines. But he states that himself. So if there's no evidence to support that, whether in an altered film or not, I mean, the real issue here is that we're basing a lot of our assumptions on a film that's either altered or it's not altered. It's a silent film. And there is way more films of Dealey Plaza. Now, Zapruder has the most revealing one that we've seen entirety. I guess it's available to the American public. Anybody who might not even know, like the younger generations who don't know who Lee Harvey Oswald is, if you show them the Zapruder film, I guarantee you they've seen it. They just don't even know the name. But I've talked to people that are like in their 20s about this, and I'm in my 20s, so it's not like a big age gap, but there's obviously a disconnect with teaching of the assassination. But the motorcade films that were available, we got the Zapruder film, you got the Nix film that's Gail Nix has been trying to sue for. The Muchmore film, the Bronson film, the Hughes film, the Bell film, the Dorman film, the Wegman film, the Couch film, the Martin film, the Daniel film, Pascal film, Jeffries film. You have another film where they're showing a gun being pulled and a bunch of people looking at it of the Dallas police that was apparently by the Texas School Book Depository. I think his name's Charles Menacito or Menasano or something like that, who was just in the motorcade that surfaced later. We see recent trending news of a motorcade, film that was going for auction. So there's obviously the president's coming to town. Anybody that has a camera is going to have a camera and going to be having it out. And this becomes an issue because the Zapruder film has been largely the one that's been mainly popularized, and a lot of people do not think about extra films being out there. But one thing that was brought forward was that there was a publishing of an article saying that anybody that had any relevant information or footage or photographs that were of Dealey Plaza that day can bring the film in and the FBI can look at it. Now, in my belief, I do think that was a great way to start squashing a lot of this extra footage and a lot of the things of that sort, because there's a lot of these films that were brought in. We have documents, plenty of people, and I have clips up on my YouTube about it, that had a film that were either nervous to bring it in a couple of years later or contacted someone about the film that they couldn't get, finalized or put in a format or developed. And there's nothing. We just have a receipt of that film going there. Where's that film? It should be available to the American public, whether it's in a crappy condition or whether it didn't show anything at all. I mean, we have the Darnell film or the Daniel film, which is after President Kennedy goes through the underpass. And half of it is just him filming the floor. So it's like, we have that film available. It doesn't show anything, whether it's edited or not. I'm not going to get into that argument, but it doesn't show much, and that's available. So where are all these receipts for all these people that contacted the FBI, and the FBI was willing to make a report, make a copy of that, either give it back or it was donated, but it's not available to the American public to view. It's our history. We should be able to view it, even for the younger generations as well, too.
I think it's worth adding, Robbie, that in terms of the Zapruder film, that Jim Garrison had to go to the Supreme Court when he had his case against Clay Shaw in the late 60s to show the Zapruder film. I mean, it wasn't like Time Life said, oh yeah, here have the film for the court case and good luck, because it was only going to be shown to the people in the court. They fought tooth and nail to avoid handing it over to Garrison, to the extent that he had to go to the Supreme Court to get access to it. So I think that does show you that Time Life had some other motive around the film. I think just to try and bury it, and it's thanks to Robert Groden really that we all got to see it. So I think a lot of kudos to him for having the guts to go on national television and show something that Time Life were quite happy to have buried away in a vault.
We are going to discuss a little bit about Garrison because Paul's work, he did a good job documenting a lot of stuff with Garrison. But I need to ask Randy this because this is a thing I talked about beforehand. But even when Randy was making his film, he had issues about using the Zapruder film footage. I've gotten comments from the sixth floor about certain things that were either used from either the Zapruder film, even like a 10-second segment where, and I've seen this across from people that have made their own personal documentaries or independent documentaries, that they got a message from the Sixth Floor Museum. Joe Green has a good example that when he was showing the Zapruder film at a conference, that he got a message that if he was going to show the Zapruder film, that he would have to pay a certain sum of money to the Sixth Floor Museum because they own the rights to that footage. Now that hinders people from wanting to make videos, whether it's their own personal viewpoint or their own either early stages of research or later stages of research, to try and keep history alive in a sense. And now you have one museum that's claiming the rights to it, which is, in my view, it's part of the American public. And it's historically just has so much significance that nobody can really claim the rights to it. It's kind of like the American Pledge of Allegiance. It's America's Pledge of Allegiance, but you can't claim it personally. But Randy, if you want to explain some of your experience using the Zapruder film and dealing with the Sixth Floor Museum.
Yeah, well, making a film about the Kennedy assassination and not being able to use the Zapruder film is insane. It just cannot be done. And I think you're exactly right. The reason it's been locked away, and only allowed by filmmakers from Discovery and History Channel who tell the official story, who just use the film to tell the official story. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to think that the Sixth Floor Museum does not want opposing views out there. So when I was making my film, I've been teaching at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University here in Durham since 2003. And I went through the proper channels and did contact the Sixth Floor Museum to ask for rights to use the film. And they wanted a full treatment a simple one sheet, and then they wanted a full treatment of my film. So I sent them that. And it was very clear that, when you tell the story of researchers of the assassination and what they've revealed and what they've discovered over the years, my film was not the official story. And so they declined without comment. They just said, I have the letter somewhere in my files, but we're not allowing access to the film for your production. Good luck with it. And so luckily at Duke, the Duke Law School, which is excellent, had just opened up the Center for the Study of the Public Domain. And it's all about fair use. The entire center at Duke Law exists for the study of fair use in film and media. And so when I met with them, the director said, "Oh, you will be using the film. You have full right to use it. It's a piece of American history, and there's no way to tell the story of the JFK assassination without using that film." So, and she said, "This is the perfect case study, and we haven't had a big case yet." And they said, "I pray they sue you, because Duke Law will take this on pro bono." And I was like, well, let's not pray for that, but thank you for your support. And so I used it. And I did get some pseudo-threatening emails and correspondence from the sixth floor, and I forwarded them to Duke Law, and they just laughed and said, "Go ahead." And so I've never, I got distribution for the film, and I never once received a formal letter threatening a lawsuit from the sixth floor museum.
Now, I get it.
And because, yeah,
I was going to say, I get it if, that's their whole thing is the sixth floor museum. We're all JFK all the time. But you're hindering growth and conversation about the assassination, whether it's something you agree with or something you disagree with, that's why I accept all these JFK theories. I like talking about them. I don't necessarily have to believe it, but I think it's important that we understand somebody's perspective of it. And there's a lot of weight in certain areas of research that these people go into that really start to examine certain things. But the Sixth Floor Museum has been what we would call a modern day gatekeeper. Now, I enjoy their oral histories. There are some that are just nonsensical. They interviewed one guy, and look, I would have done it too. But maybe not the full hour they gave him. He was a driver who delivered books to the Texas School Book Depository and left 10 minutes before the shooting happened. He was actually at the Dell Tex building when the shooting happened. He did not see a thing, doesn't even remember what he was delivering, doesn't remember if he ever saw Lee Harvey Oswald, doesn't remember if anybody even picked up the books out of the back of his truck. All he complained about it that it wasn't his route and he didn't want to work it. And sadly, he had to work it. But he accepted the interview invitation anyway. But Paul has a different perspective on the oral histories, and I think he has a great point about it, which is that there aren't really hard-hitting questions that are asked. Things that would be basic follow-up stuff that you would ask, especially if you're conspiracy-minded, that we're not. And that is part of media, and still I'm more relevant about modern-day media when it comes to representation of the JFK assassination, considering that people are passing over all the time. So, Paul, if you want to maybe share a little bit.
Yeah, with so with my latest interest with the Ruby shooting Oswald, I've and we will come to this a bit later, but there was just so very little contemporary reports and accounts from media that were present at the shooting. So, and even after the benefit of 60 years that have passed, articles and things over the years, I just could not find, for what I think is 46 members of the media that were in the immediate vicinity of Oswald being shot. Very, very little accounts and in years past from reporters that were there. So it was when I found the oral history a series through the Sixth Floor Museum that it was great. It was able to finally hear from people like not even just media, people like Fred Bieberdorf, who was the first aid attendant that attended to Oswald, and quite a few reporters. Peggy Simpson, the only female in the basement at the time, never gave a statement to any of the investigations, but the interview was carried out, I think it was 2007, 40 years after the fact, with very little in between from the incident itself. And just like you said, Robbie, very softball, low ball kind of questions that just allowed these people that I watched in the context of the Oswald shooting just to tell whatever story their memory remembered. It didn't seem, a lot of certainty, with the recollections and, a little bit of distortions compared to what some people testified to at the time. So I think the Oral History Project, I think it's more for prosperity's sake, really, and probably a profile piece for the museum itself.
I will say, if you've interviewed people before, you would know what it's like to ask a question that might lead to a more difficult response from somebody. I like to keep mine conversation, so we stay on a friendly, having a coffee basis, which makes me ask the interesting stuff, like to Blakey about Oswald getting a venereal disease in the line of duty, then asking him about the person that broke into the safe and went through autopsy photographs. You don't ask those questions if you're a part of a main news outlet. That will never be asked, because there'd be a silence like there was in my show, and then a moment where he could have just shut off his computer, but he decided to give me a response back, whether it was I don't remember, I don't recall. We see this commonly with any interview, mainstream news that goes on when it comes to the Kennedy assassination and other various areas, 9/11 and other subjects as well too. There's a question that you feel like, hey, why didn't you ask that? It just wasn't asked because it's just not, they would call it manners. But obviously, if you're looking for truth, we just need to kind of separate reporter versus investigative journalist, where we might see a little bit different questions. But one thing, we talk about a lot of criticism of the media, it was left to a lot of independent researchers and people to pick up the scraps or do the investigative work. And since if they weren't an investigator or they weren't a reporter of a main established news network, they weren't taken with full credibility. Randy mentioned it earlier about certain people that saw something that were interviewed. A lot of that stuff comes from Mark Lane. We have Mark Lane's interviews with a lot of the railroad workers that showed evidence that there was something that should have been investigated that wasn't. And without those, we wouldn't know, because if you examine these people's statements, their FBI reports, that was not a question that was asked to them, or it was never followed up, or it was edited out of the report. The FBI questions, read every single documentation. What does it end with? I have never seen Lee Harvey Oswald and didn't recognize the name before November 22nd, 1963. You start noticing, all these questions, you guys would have you've written down template of 5 questions to ask, and then everyone gives a different response. That's why all these reports look the same. They weren't interested in trying to see what that person saw, or you tell me what you saw. What did you see? That's where we have people like Mark Lane, and I'll share this real quick because it's one of the railroad workers, but it's really important and it gives weight to what I'm saying here. I picked the worst one. No offense. I love his accent. It's Calvin Dodd, but he's not the best public speaker out of the railroad workers. But I know if you mention any of the railroad workers, people would mention this guy as listen to him talk. He sounds nonsensical. But he mentions, and you can read the caption right here, came from, we all 3 seen 4 seen about the same thing. And I'll play it real quick.
The smoke came from behind the hedge on the north side of the plaza, and a motorcycle policeman dropped his motorcycle in the street with his gun in his hand and run up the embankment to the hedge.
But you were never called as a witness by the Warren?
No, I never was called.
Because here's the Warren report, and in the index your name is not listed, and there's no reference in the whole 888 pages to the fact that you were up there and you saw what you saw, you heard what you heard.
Well, I don't know about that. But there was something that looks to me like that going on there, that somebody should have found out something. A man walk up and shoot a man handcuffed a couple of policemen and get away with it. Why, I figured there's something else that's going on besides what it should be.
Now, without Mark Lane, we wouldn't have any of that, or we would have no knowledge on that based on the statement from Calvin Dodd. There is a statement, an FBI little tiny little report, and it's much like James Leon Simmons. And I think they've estimated it was 18 or 15 people up on the railroad. A couple were police officers that were not supposed to let anybody up there unless they were working on the railroad. There's like 9, maybe 11 of them that I have documented on my YouTube channel that all saw something coming from the area of the knoll, whether it was smoke or whether there was movement or whether they decided to go check out over there. Even one of the patrolman officers that went over there as well too. But it's not in the patrolman's statements. It's not in his FBI report. It's not in his documentation. So this idea of smoke coming from the grassy knoll and all this type of stuff, we would have none of that if there wasn't for certain independent investigators or people like Mark Lane doing the legwork and willing to discuss that. Which, I mean, anybody that wants to add on top of that, that's just very important. And that's a main drop from the media of not doing their job properly and investigating. I mean, they made open claims. They investigated crazy stories about psychics predicting the assassination. And damn it, I can't say it's crazy because they predicted like 3 things and they got all 3 things right. I was like, all right, dude, what the? One woman said she was getting, no, one guy said he was getting visions that Marilyn Monroe was going to die. And it was literally the day he guessed was 2 days before Marilyn did die by exactly suicide, which is what he said. And then he's like, and then Kennedy will be killed. And then someone's going to kidnap a member of the Frank Sinatra family. And this was like the 26th or 27th of November. And, the document was dated that. I think it was before people confirmed that he said it. But then, in December 8th, like 2 days or 1 day after he said the thing, Frank Sinatra's son's kidnapped. I'm like, all right. If he says he's getting visions of it, I'm just saying he's 3 for 3 right now. You know, we can't just like toss that out. But what's your guys' perspective on obviously independent researchers? Randy, obviously you've interviewed some, but anyone else can really add here because we've all examined work of some of the first generation researchers that gave us the credit. Weisberg's a good example.
Robbie, just quickly, I mean, I think we owe Mark Lane a kind of massive debt of gratitude for exactly, the point you've made there about going out and interviewing people and getting it on the record. I think he did an amazing job, and I always, from time to time, like watching. I think the program was called Firing Line, and it was William Buckley. Now, I think William Buckley was one of these CIA assets in the media, one of these Operation Mockingbird individuals, and they had an interview in I think it was 1966, and I would recommend anybody that's watching this later to try and find that, the Firing Line program with Mark Lane and William Buckley, because again, Mark Lane's he is literally putting himself in the firing line, and it's just a fantastic interview and how he defends his position, how he picks apart the Warren Commission, picks apart the idea that there was a lone gunman. And, I just think that's fantastic. And also Dorothy Colgallen was another very important person who, interviewed Jack Ruby a number of times and then allegedly was going to blow the case wide open and then is found suspiciously, they call it a suicide, or one of the many suicides that we've got in this case. But yeah, Mark Lane certainly somebody who's a real hero.
Yes, so I'm so glad you brought up not only William F. Buckley, but Dorothy Colgallen. The names of the media, both on the good side and the bad side, there's just thousands. A lot of work needs to be done still on Mark Lane to get to the bottom of it. But yeah, you're right. I mean, if you look at the more recent documentary done on him by Pauly, the lady that was in NCIS, that's a very loving portrait of Mark Lane. And I think a lot of it is right. And Mark Lane comes across very well, very believable. And he did we owe him a huge debt of gratitude. But whether by manipulation or whatever else, he got into some very strange stuff later on. And that may have been, a way of attacking him, which, that's what they do in the media. There's Seth Cantor. There's There's Earl Goals, who I knew personally. He was a mentor of mine. There's, Gordon McClendon. I prepared a lot on Gordon McClendon for later. But right now, since you mentioned Ruby, I found some interesting things in this book, Burying the Lead by Mal Hyman. Mal is in South Carolina, and he met him at the conferences. He's running for Congress this year. I don't know how his election's going.
He runs for Congress like every year. He did it when I talked to him like 2 years ago.
Right, he did it before, and he's doing it this year. I hope he's doing well. But fantastic book. Example, right after Oswald's first appearance before the press, Jack Ruby ran into Ike Pappas, CBS reporter from New York, and immediately set up an interview for him with Henry Wade. That's who Jack Ruby was. Jack Ruby had access to all kinds of things, and particularly Gordon McClendon, but we can get into that later. Seth Cantor. Hyman says right off the bat at the beginning of his book that the FBI edited some very early reports from the Dallas Times-Herald. Now, Seth Cantor was with the Dallas Morning News. I'll give you an example of Times-Herald in a minute. But Seth Cantor was with Dallas Morning News. And years later, he checked why the Warren Commission and the FBI had classified for 12 years telephone calls that he made during the afternoon of the assassination. He found that in FBI document 1133, which was about his calls, quote, his calls might reveal the identity of confidential sources. So Cantor's racking his brain about who he could have called that afternoon that would have been a confidential source. One of his calls was to Hal Hendricks, who was a Scripps Howard journalist, for background on Oswald. And he was given extensive information from Hendricks that afternoon.
One correction, it's not Dallas Morning News, it's Dallas Times-Herald, I thought.
According to Mal Hyman.
Well, it's in his Warren Commission testimony right here. I was on the Dallas Times-Herald in Dallas, Texas, intermittently. I was on the Fort Worth Press, and I was a Scripps Howard paper. He did go to the Dallas Times-Herald later, but he's worked for all the papers. So I mean, he's
same thing with Earl Goals, and Earl Goals ended up at the Austin American-Statesman. But yeah, they went back and forth at both papers. These were the two major papers in Dallas.
And they chose a stripper statements over his. That's what's crazy. Think about that.
And I'm always getting confused with Earl about which paper he was with at the time. So maybe Mal got confused there. But let's give him credit about that. I mean, it's hard to keep track of which paper they were at. But anyway, but we know Hal Hendricks was a Scripps Howard. And of course, Seth Cantor had his relationship with Seth Cantor. Seth Cantor's the guy who saw Ruby at Parkland, by the way. Now, according to CIA officials, remember Hendricks gave him extensive information about Oswald that afternoon. According to CIA officials, Seth Cantor found out, Hendricks was one of their most valuable assets in the 1960s. So yeah, talk about Mockingbird. I mean, I know you want to go into Mockingbird. This might be a good time to do it, but there you go. There's Hal Hendricks, valuable CIA asset in the 60s, giving Seth Cantor detailed information on Oswald that very afternoon.
Well,
there you go. What else do you want to know?
Largely, this covers an area that Paul's done great work in. Paul, you want to take the reins from me?
Yeah, I'd definitely add to what Richard was saying. So there was Hal Hendricks, who was Operation Mockingbird, and there was another reporter that was present when Ruby shot Oswald, and that was Jerry O'Leary from the Washington Star-Times. He was named in an article by Carl Bernstein in the 70s as also being part of Operation Mockingbird, so an asset for the CIA through the media. His role as a reporter, where I think it may not have been at the time, November 1963, was that O'Leary was most prolific or he was referenced to his work for the CIA across Central America. So I'm not sure if that was in the early 60s or if that came later on. But just to know that whether they were a present CIA asset or one in the making, you had Jerry O'Leary, who was right there next to would be next to Hendricks in terms of being part of Operation Mockingbird there at the time when Oswald was shot. And very interestingly about Jerry O'Leary as well, he would report that Tom Howard was telling the press how Ruby actually entered the basement down Main Street ramp very, very early after the obviously after Oswald's shooting, and before he actually got up to see Jack Ruby on the 5th floor of City Hall. So Jerry O'Leary, he was definitely a very elusive character for another couple of reasons at City Hall on November 24th. And you cannot find any written word from him about his movements on that weekend, other than what he testified to the FBI.
And a lot of people ask what the media importance in all this would be, is because a lot of the media are also responsible for some of the conspiracy theories that they choose not to want to highlight, and they want to act like they're above. The reason I mention this is I think everyone, it's kind of been well accepted that Walter Cronkite was like the first person to come on about the JFK assassination and report the death of President Kennedy. It's actually not true. I've read 5 different accounts from 5 different reporters that all have stated or made the claim that they were in charge of their news station, and they were the very first ones to actually do it. And the one I've been able to narrow down as actually being the first person to technically report. Now, it wasn't a confirmed report, but it was Eddie Barker. Now, I'm going to play this real quick, but it's very interesting because we talk about the rifle changing. They're reporting on a different rifle. Then suddenly it all kind of converges together and gets to this one point. The reporters of the assassination, this response that we rely on our media to give us the news as soon as possible, and everyone's in this competitive angle, has also created a large area of these conspiracy theories that they choose to neglect. And one example is with Eddie Barker. He was at the trademark when Kennedy was killed. Now, he says 3 things here I'm going to play that a lot of people like, what? But maybe you guys will find this a little bit interesting. So I'm going to play it real quick. All right. Here we go.
Word in a spirit of prayer in thy holy name. Amen.
That was the Reverend Luther Holcomb, who is the Executive Secretary of the Dallas Council of Churches, and who was to have given the invocation here for the President's address today. As you can imagine, there are many stories that are coming in now as to the actual condition of the President. One is that he is dead. This cannot be confirmed. Another is that Governor Connally is in the operating room. This we have not confirmed. Another is, and apparently this is correct, that one of the Secret Service agents whose job it was to guard the life of the President was killed in his line of duty. The President was whisked from the scene of the attempted assassination or assassination.
Now I'm going to stop it there only because so the 2 reports that he said were unconfirmed probably were true. And then the one report he said was confirmed was actually probably the most inaccurate. Kennedy, in my opinion, was dead after he was shot or on the way to Parkland. I believe he died. But I believe that, you're not pronounced dead. We're not going to get into that argument, Rich. We already did that off air. But the second one, Governor Connally being in surgery, I think that's just basic medical procedure when they had him in there, that they were going to be working on him or trying their best to work on Governor Connally after JFK was taken care of. But the third one about the Secret Service agent, now that does mention, through Rich kind of opened me up to it, which was the pool of blood in Dealey Plaza. That was there, that got chalked up later by the media as being a red snow cone. We have one photo of it. Now, we do have the interview of Jerry Coley. Now, Jerry Coley said that with Jim Hood, he went over there and took a photograph of this pool of blood in Dealey Plaza, and Jim Hood had stuck his finger in it, licked it, and said that it's blood. Now, he was interviewed by the FBI, and the FBI took his photograph of the pool of blood and then say, forget you ever saw anything. And you can watch that interview because, again, another independent researcher decided, I don't remember if it's Jim Mars or somebody, Sylvia, maybe, I don't know. They interviewed Jerry Coley, and it's all listed there. I have the clip of it on my YouTube channel. But that lead was never pursued. Now, again, we talk about media responsibility here. Eddie Barker making those statements about a Secret Service, that spreads conspiracy theories, obviously. And then we have the evidence or the trail or the investigative lead that should have been pursued, which was the person that said that they took a photograph of it and an FBI agent confiscated their photograph. That was never pursued by major media outlets. So again, we have reporting on the assassination, whether it's nefarious or whether it's not, I don't know, but there's a lot of things here that everything you look at this assassination, there's leads that were never pursued. I showed this to Rich, and I think I showed this to Brad, and I think I might have showed it to Paul, but the unidentified reporter in the police basement, the Asian reporter that nobody can tell me who or what his name is, nobody bothered to get it. This guy interviews Henry Wade and we don't know his name. That's nuts to me. And that's what happens with history. When you don't talk about the JFK assassination, you consider it, oh, that was 60 years ago. That's also what happens when you're not properly reporting on it, which is kind of like the main whole point to this conversation about the media and the representation and the issues before, during, and after with the JFK assassination.
Exactly. Can I say something real quick,
yes,
Robbie?
Go ahead. Sorry.
After 60 years, I'm still finding stuff that's new to me, that blows my mind. And this was about that very thing you were just talking about, and it was in Mal Hyman's book, Burying the Lead. On page 15 of his book, the Dallas Times-Herald ran a piece featuring interviews with Gene Hill and Mary Moorman. Quote, they glanced up to see a man run up the hill across the street from them, the grassy knoll, and another near the motorcade pepper bullets at the running figure. The next day, the Dallas Times-Herald shifted the shots to the Texas School Book Depository. I'd never heard that story before. But once again, you have the so-called dead Secret Service agent, which I think was a cover story for what really happened. You have, and we won't go into the details of this, but look up Bertha Lozano's deposition. It's in the Warren Commission. I've talked about it on Robbie's podcast before. Some mysterious guy was brought in by two other mysterious guys, and every clue about that has disappeared. And let me tell you something about Bertha Lozano that I probably shouldn't, but I think it's time. I won't give you all the details. But I know her cousin. I met her cousin through contacts in state government when she was working for Kay Bailey Hutchison. And I won't give you her name because of privacy for the family, which is what they want. And they don't want me telling this story. But Bertha Lozano disappeared. She was an emergency room triage nurse.
The Mr. X.
Yeah, Mr. X is in her deposition, brought in by two guys in suits, and lots of blood was involved. And people from the people handling the blood and the transfusions and stuff came back to her asking for information about Mr. X. We don't have any paperwork on this guy. Who is it? And nobody had any information, and nobody ever heard about it again. Well, here's what happened to Bertha Lozano. She disappeared shortly after the assassination in '64. She was gone for a year. She showed up after a year of being completely missing on a beach in Florida, completely nude, complete, total amnesia. And
fuck, I've had hangovers before, but that's crazy.
She was eventually returned to the family, and the family stayed quiet. They were scared to death. Her memory gradually, bits and pieces started coming back, but the family doesn't want they don't want to go anywhere near this. They're frightened because of who she was, what she saw, and what happened to her. And they're in fear. And that's what the media has done to this. Nobody's ever reported on Bertha Lozano, but there's a major story there that has been completely hidden. And that's all I have to say about that.
Well, even
but we now have this guy having some guy running up the hill which is where the blood was up there. One of the pools of blood was up there at the top of the stairs. And we have a guy running up there, and we have another guy down on the street peppering bullets at him. So there you go.
Well, we have obviously there was a Secret Service agent up there that was unidentified, and I think the investigative lead on that has kind of led up to independent researchers to do that, because all Secret Service agents stated that there was nobody from their detail that was involved up there on the Knolls. So we just don't know if there was this, and there's even reporting articles that you can look up about rumors of a Secret Service agent up there. Not there was one, rumors. Like, this nut job heard this about a Secret Service agent up there flashing a badge. That's, again, we have media not chasing down leads, or even with like Gary Fagan from the 6-4 Museum that doesn't want to ask certain questions. But also we have people's statements that are being edited and changed. One instance, and Brad can probably speak a little bit more about this, is Crenshaw seeing somebody, an FBI agent with J. Doyle Williams, being punched in the face. Was he punched in the face? Crenshaw stated that, I think he said that I'm positive that man's jaw was broken. But then we have the report. So we know that there was a tussle between Secret Service agents at Parkland Hospital, between an FBI agent and members of the Secret Service. But in that memo, besides Rowley apologizing for the conduct of his Secret Service, the FBI then begins to explain that he actually wasn't punched in the face. I think your men just threw him to the ground. And then this. Well, David Lifton, he never published the video, but talked about interviewing J. Doyle Williams, and said that the Secret Service agent had whispered into his ear and said that this is obviously where you shouldn't be, and then let the guy get up and walk out. But this guy, you could say that's extreme security measures because Kennedy's in trauma room, but that was another angle that was never pursued. Why do we have these accounts or these random blips of information, these things that can be chalked up to wild conspiracy theories where someone has to question and say, show me your documentation to? Well, we don't have some documentation for a lot of this stuff because either it wasn't written down or was never pursued, which is a lot that does not fall within the official narrative. Now, Brad, if you want to talk about what Crenshaw's account of that was, if you remember it, and then maybe we can get into Crenshaw's lawsuit as well, too, because that's another issue. Someone who wasn't doing anything but reporting on what they saw into the trauma room, trying to come forward about a statement, a medical doctor. That's just stating what he saw or what he encountered, and now he's being sued for his statements as well, too. So we'll cover both of those.
Okay. Charles Crenshaw, of course, was a resident in surgery. He was in the trauma room, and for some reason, he was a close friend of mine, but we didn't discuss exactly why. But he ended up leaving the trauma room briefly. And at that time, as he leaves, he notices a guy in a suit who he assumes is Secret Service with a long gun, which I'm guessing is possibly George Hickey, who produced the AR-15 during the shooting itself. You can see that AR clearly in photos on Stemmons Freeway. It's the gun everyone's afraid of now, the black gun. As he's returning to the trauma room, rather, he never said it was an FBI agent. He said he saw a man approach the entrance to Trauma 1, at which time the agent with the long gun took the butt of said gun and whacked him across the jaw. At that moment, the guy collapsed to the ground. His eyes glazed over, and Dr. Crenshaw said, at that moment, I knew that guy's jaw was busted, but I had the president dying in the next room, so I went on around him. Obviously, a busted jaw is not a life-threatening wound. He never did say it was an FBI agent, but there are not that many scuffles going on at Parkland. So I think possibly it was the same thing. A lot of people believe Crenshaw. A lot of people don't. I knew the man. I tend to go with what he said. Maybe I'm naive, but that's the Crenshaw version of the two, I guess you'd call them sort of government agents, presumably, getting into it at the hospital.
But again, this is another issue with investigative reporting, is that when someone chooses to blur the account or edit it in a certain way, we don't have the factual information, and eventually we don't know, like the unidentified reporter in the basement. Nobody reported that, so we just don't know.
And he didn't, obviously stop and take time to say, "Hey, who are you? Why is this guy whacking you across the face with a rifle butt?" So that's, we're missing some information there, but he had bigger things on his mind at that moment.
There's also, when we talk about Warren Commission and asking certain questions, there's obviously directed questions, certain areas that, much like with oral history interviews, things that would have been like, hey, can you follow up on the back wound of the head? And then it's just like added on to something else. Like I can't remember, but it's Arlen Specter interviewing somebody, but it's about, where'd you find the bullet? This stretcher? Are you sure it wasn't this stretcher over here? What about, it could have been this stretcher, right? I'm like, bro, he said it was that stretcher 4 times. You don't need to keep asking him. He's pretty sure it was that stretcher, not the one you keep suggesting or pointing towards. But we see that a lot throughout the Warren Commission, certain directing or certain kind of nudging in certain areas. Now, when we talk about the media and the reporting of the Warren Commission, there is a big problem that I have. It's a conflict of interest. But when we talk about the Warren Commission, Earl Warren being in charge of the Warren Commission, he denied his other members at looking at autopsy photographs because he deemed them too graphic for the other members to make their decision, and also interviewed Jackie Kennedy privately for privacy reasons. Earl Warren should have never been on that commission. The media reporting on it has been nothing but supportive towards the Warren Commission's efforts, even a document stating that within the first release of the report, they were going to have a special all lined up supporting the main official version of the Warren report. So, I mean, that's just weird. You'd think you would wait, watch it, not have one already ready to release, as the Warren report is targeted to be released as well, too. So that's obviously some insider stuff going on there.
I think what that people, American people were badly let down by the media because, I mean, the lack of curiosity and investigative work on the case in the years following is just, I mean, it's a dereliction of duty, really. And when you think about the Warren Commission, I mean, there may have been some examples, but generally speaking, there didn't seem to be any kind of criticism of even who was on the Warren Commission. I mean, you would think the media would say, well, why is Alan Dulles on the Warren Commission? Why is the guy who Kennedy sacked a couple of years ago, well, what's he doing on it? Why is, an ex-banker, in the World Bank and, who was in Germany for many years, what's he doing on the Warren Commission? That there was no curiosity at all. And even like the hearings, I mean, am I right in saying most of the hearings were behind kind of closed doors? I mean, you think an inquisitive media doing its job would be wanting to kick those doors down. They would want to be in there. They would want to hear what is being said. But they weren't. They were just so timid. They turned the other way and just accepted everything that was being said. Now, some people may say, well, they were, they in a way that they didn't want to upset the apple cart. Maybe they were the same, and that let's just let the government do their work. But they're journalists. They're the media. They should be out there questioning what is going on, and they just never did that from day one. And with regards to the Warren Commission, absolutely, was it CBS, as you say, they had their special all lined up almost the minute the Warren Commission had been released to the public. How can that be so? How can you have a program ready to go so soon after the public have got to see the commission? So, really, 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 really strange behaviour. And I just think, that they were either incompetent or more likely they were complicit in a cover-up.
Well, all these reporters aren't idiots, but if you look at every single document that details either K-Box Radio and something, KRLD, WFAA, WBAP, they all say NBC affiliate. You don't need every single station independently messaged in conversation to have. You just need one of the main producers or one of the main establishments that they all work under, which we'll get into, Rich. I know you got work on Gordon McClendon. I got a lot of work on him too, especially when it comes to Ruby and being involved in the Dallas police basement. But when we're sticking along the lines of the subject of the media and the Warren Commission, Randy's brought this example up multiple times, but the document 1035-960. Randy, if you have something else, go ahead first.
Yeah. No, this is a perfect segue to that. But let's remember that as today, there is mainstream media, major media, corporate media, and back then there was what's called minor media. So let's not forget that there were media organizations, for instance, Penn Jones, right down there at the Midlothian Mirror. He was all over the case from the very beginning. He was reporting all the anomalies, all the witness deaths, and so that voice was getting out there in a little way. And I think all of this points to a failing of the American public to force the questions to be asked, to demand that they be asked. And I think it also points to the fact that the American public was coerced into being scared that, what if this is revealed, it was during the height of the Cold War and those fears were just being sowed. But there were media organizations out there who were doing really good work. And more than anything, this really points to the role of the researchers, that the first generation and the second generation and all the way up and to my colleagues here, that they have done and are doing the work that the major media never did, asking the tough questions, getting the evidence.
Now,
FOIA requests after FOIA requests.
Yeah, and being delayed for so long, a number of people that aren't with us anymore that should have got their answers in their lifetime and dedicated their lives to researching it as well too. John Judge is a good example. Cyril Wecht as well too, for the work that he has done. And then the media representation and the people that try and counter their points when they are gone. A number of articles came out about Cyril Wecht, speaking about how Wecht was deranged or brought, I guess he was stuck in a corner about his conspiracy views, that he was really, all these researchers had kind of twisted it in his mind of what he actually saw. And I was like, well, he was one of the first. That's why as soon as I saw articles like that, I had researchers on to speak about Cyril Wecht a little bit to kind of counter those initial points. Because anyone that actually knew Cyril Wecht, I've spoken with him. I never published the episode, but you can find clips up on my channel with him about it, because I had happened to come at him at a late time. And to me, I think everyone that knows towards the end, he was a little bit different than maybe we saw older videos, and I wanted to keep him in the memory that he was when he was speaking about a lot of this. But he was very, very stern on his understanding that as the American public, we deserve an answer to this. And there's a lot of things like Kennedy's missing brain. Why isn't that a media conversation? That is the most interesting thing. I can watch an influencer that I've never heard of before go missing for 2 months, and it's like the main popular story, and it's on every single station. But we can't get anything about where our president's brain was, where it's located, where did it go, why is it missing? One of the most botched autopsies in history. We don't have any articles or anything like that. Every anniversary, it's just a puff piece. But Randy, real quick, do you mind explaining briefly what the 1035-960 document was? And then I'm going to show it up here and maybe read a little bit from it.
Yeah, so 1035-960 is most likely, well, it's one of the most important documents, post-war documents, post-World War II documents released to the American public. And in that document, the CIA Office of PSYOPs, Psychological Operations, sent a letter to all their bureaus around the country stating, the title was Countering Criticism of the Warren Report. And it gave a step-by-step guide on how to criticize people who were researchers who were criticizing the Warren Report. And it stated things like, say that they're communist sympathizers, say that they're in it for the money, say that they're just trying to prop up their own ego and their own status. And the interesting thing, and it's in my film, but at the very bottom it says destroyed when no longer needed. And so the interesting thing about that is that almost immediately after that document got out, you could almost do a case study on every single media outlet in the United States parroting those things. So Mark Lane wrote a book called Rush to Judgment, and here's a review of it. And it's like line by line parodying 1035-960.
Which a lot of the files,
remarkable.
If you look at a lot of the files on the JFK assassination that are released, there are plenty of things or clippings of newspaper articles or certain criticisms of the Warren Commission or anything else that did come out, and they would have the title of the book. I'll try and find it and I'll try and share it, but Ronnie Duggar did an amazing, like the very first paragraph of criticism of the Warren Commission. I did a clip up about it. I have to read it word for word because it is so, in my opinion, that's like the best I've seen about like really the overall explanation of what we've all been saying for however many episodes now on the show. But this is the article 1035-960. Now, anybody that would have just listened to this and not, seen this or me shared on screen right now and would have just heard Randy say that, they'd be like, oh yeah, okay, sure. Destroy when no longer needed. Well, here's the article right here. And Randy is correct. Countering criticism of the Warren Report. It says, from the day of the President Kennedy's assassination on, there has been speculation about the responsibility for his murder. Although this was stemmed for a time by the Warren Commission report, which appeared at the end of September 1964, various writers have now had time to scan the Commission's published report and documents for new pretext for questioning, and there's been a new wave of books and articles criticizing the Commission's findings. In most cases, the critics have speculated as the existence of some kind of conspiracy, and often they have implied that the Commission itself was involved, presumably as a result of the increasing challenge to the Warren Commission's report. A public poll recently indicated that 46% of the American public did not think that Oswald acted alone, while more than half of those polled thought that the Commission had left some questions unresolved. Doubtless polls abroad about how similar or possibly more adverse results. This trend of opinion is a matter of concern to the United States government, including our organization. The members of the Warren Commission were naturally chosen for their integrity, experience, and prominence. They represented both of the country. They represented both major parties, and their staff were deliberately drawn from all sections of the country. Just because of the standing of the commissioners' efforts to impugn their rectitude and wisdom tend to cast doubt on the whole leadership of the American society. Moreover, there seems to be an increasing tendency to hint that President Johnson himself is one of the person who might have be said to have benefited, was in some way responsible for the assassination. And I don't know if it's on this page of it, but it does state about labeling certain people conspiracy theorists. I don't know. Yeah, if it says it.
I think it may be at the bottom there, Robbie. The aim of this dispatch is to provide material for countering and discrediting the claims of the conspiracy theorists, so as to inhibit the circulation of such claims in other countries.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, and this is very interesting that in this document, the joining of those two words in American lexicon, this is where it originated, conspiracy and theorist. And as John Judge said in my film, after this, there was no conspiracy that wasn't just a theory.
I love it right here. Conspiracy theories have frequently thrown suspicion on our organization. For example, by falsely alleging that Lee Harvey Oswald worked for us, which they denied that they had a 201 file on Lee Harvey Oswald, and then turns out they did have a 201 file on Oswald. But right at the bottom there, it says destroy when no longer needed, just like you were saying, Randy. Now, one of the things it mentions here about when it talks about the Warren Commission and picking up it says, just because of the standing of the commissioners' efforts to impugn their rectitude and wisdom tend to cast doubt on the whole leadership of the American society. But it says the members of the Warren Commission were naturally chosen for their integrity, experience, and prominence. Were they, though? I mean, I hate to be that guy that wants to criticize that, but one more thing I want to kind of share here is the LBJ and J. Edgar Hoover phone call of the creation of the Warren Commission. I think that speaks for itself about what exactly the Warren Commission members were picked for. Play that real quick, and then we'll get back to the conversation. Again, sorry for hijacking the episode here, but I think it's important.
Your report. I think it would be very, very bad to have a rash of investigations. Well, the only way we can stop them is probably to appoint a high-level one to evaluate your report. Yeah. And put somebody that's pretty good on it from that I can select out of the government and tell the House and Senate not to go ahead with the investigation. Yes. Because they get up there and get a bunch of television going, and I thought it'd be bad. It'd be a three-ring circus. Yes. What do you think about Allen Dulles? I think he would be a good man. What do you think about John McCloy? I'm not as enthusiastic about McCloy I knew him back in the Patterson, when Patterson was down here, the secretary thing. He's a good man.
Now, I'm not going to play the whole thing, but every member, and I mean every member, I don't mean just a select few, but every member had private or public doubts about the Warren Commission's finding in one certain area of the case. John McCloy was one of the main supporters of the Warren Commission, was willing to squash a lot of conspiracy theories. He was about as bad as Gerald Ford, which we've all know about Gerald Ford's involvement on the Warren Commission, J. Edgar Hoover's inside man. But John McCloy did not believe that he believed that Governor Connolly stated that he wasn't hit by the same bullet as JFK. Which is still against the official narrative. Even Malcolm Kilduff stated in an oral history interview when they were recreating the Warren Commission thing, and also when the HSCA was doing his investigation, he was like, "How was I not called?" And then he explains in his oral history interview, I have a clip of it on my channel. He states that you're telling me one man took a shot and he explains the whole sixth floor shooting. And then he goes, but didn't he try and shoot General Walker or something like that? And he couldn't even hit him through a guy sitting at a desk standing still, which was a main question for a lot of people that really wasn't investigated. And Scott, you can probably speak on that a little bit as well too. But what LBJ just said there about not having a rash of investigations, he was happy to have J. Edgar Hoover, his report be the conclusive, here's the investigation, here's the work that we did. But it was all these other investigations or ideas of investigations that were going on that he was like, let's just have one committee that we appoint, that we all know. And we know about Earl Warren was reluctant to serve, or not Earl Warren, John Russell was reluctant to serve on the Warren Commission. And we have that phone call from LBJ where he states, we'll already announced your name, so you're going to serve. And he was like, I don't really want to do it. And he was like, look, I don't want to sick the FBI on you, but you're goddamn going to serve. And so we have this kind of, I guess, different idea of the Warren Commission now based on what the public had at the time, which was all these studded members with great reputations that are going to do the job correctly. And then we look at how many of them actually attended the initial interviews with witnesses and were actually there for them. None of them sat in on all the interviews. It was mainly left up to the secondary commission that was a team of lawyers. That's why if you read a lot of these documents, it kind of is like lawyer speak, where it's like, I mean, you're not lying, you're just being dirty lawyer speak.
I mean, there's Bill Casey, that was the CIA director in the early 80s. Did he not make a comment about we'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false? So I think that's just another indicator of, the kind of the state apparatus, if you like, trying to control the story, trying to control what goes out there, trying to undermine anybody who's got a genuine desire to find out what happened.
Feel free. Anybody else want to add anything?
By the way, this isn't unique to America either. I mean, the British media have a lot to answer for as well. I mean, thinking to like the Falklands War in 1982, I mean, there was a famous report of when the task force had got down to the Falklands and a bunch of Harrier jets went out to bomb the runway in Port Stanley. And a BBC journalist said, I can't tell you how many planes there were, but I counted them all out and I counted them all back. And the insinuation there is that, all the planes went out, did the bombing and all came back and they were fine. But actually one of them allegedly been shot down. So you either can't count or, it's just another example of the state and the media conspiring to keep the truth from the public.
Well, also the way we talk about conspiracy based on that 1035 document, you can look at how we talk about conspiracies in America. You get looked at a certain way, and it's not JFK assassination. Everyone now over here just rolls their eyes. But speaking from someone who's from Scotland and speaking from someone who's from Australia, Paul, I mean, you guys have an interest in it. I was hoping to have Russell Kent involved in here because he's from the UK, and he's like, we just don't talk about conspiracies like you guys do. We look at it like an actual conspiracies happen. Those are real things that do occur. We all know about it, but the way that we look at it now, if that word even comes up, it's like, this is all fantasy information. And Rich, Yes, that was a luring question for you to speak about what you've mentioned multiple times in many conversations about deciphering the word conspiracy and fantasy. So we'll start with Scott, the reception in Scotland, Paul, the reception in Australia, and then we'll hit up to you, Rich, with the separation of fantasy and conspiracy.
I mean, sorry, do you want me to speak there, Robbie?
You're in Scotland, so
yeah. I'm in Scotland. That is correct. No, I mean, I'm a member of the Dealey Plaza UK group, and I don't know how many other groups outside America actually hold an annual conference like we do. And we held one in Canterbury a few weeks ago. In fact, Paul made a really excellent presentation at that conference, and Richard couple of months ago, I think, did a Zoom talk that lasted about 12 hours or something like that. It's certainly one of the record ones for timing. But yeah, I mean, in Scotland, there's me and one other guy, Johnny Cairns, that some of you may know, and I don't know anybody else that's really that interested in the case, to be honest with you. I mean, I'm not saying we keep it alive in Scotland because we don't write for national newspapers or anything, but we certainly try and get as many articles and items published in websites and magazines as we can, just to kind of keep it alive. But in the UK, I mean, another good example that springs to mind was with Prince Harry served in Afghanistan, I think around about 2007, 2008. I think that was around about that time. And there was a complete media blackout of the fact that he was serving there. And that was all agreed in advance between the newspapers, the TV, the Ministry of Defence, the government. They all agreed that let's not tell anybody that he's out there. Now, on the one hand, you could argue, well, that seems reasonable. He would be a target if the enemy, if you like, knew he was there, and his comrades would be a target. That's true enough, but equally, it is an example of media blackout. And what else? What else are they not? What else do the media and the governments talk about that don't get released to the public? So it's hard to know because you don't know what you don't know. I don't want to say that it was Donald Rumsfeld quote. But you don't know what you don't know, and the British public back then had no idea that he was in Afghanistan, and it was a convenient arrangement between the media and the Ministry of Defence and the British state, basically. So, we've got our own problems across the pond when it comes to the media reporting properly for the people, and I'm sure it's the same in Australia.
I will say before Paul gives his answer here for Australia, after Rich explains conspiracy and fantasy, we're going to head into the Jack Ruby shooting and some of the reporting, just because Paul, I know it's getting late over there for him. It's probably around midnight. So because then after that, if he wants to drop out, we can continue the conversation on other areas. Paul, you're welcome for doing that. I was thinking about you, homie.
Thanks, Robbie. Appreciate it. No, I'm loving this. It's probably a good opportunity for me to say that it's actually a fairly lonely topic to be interested in Australia. People obviously know about President Kennedy and us as a country. We're relatively young in terms of our system. So we're probably very heavily influenced by the United States. There's a saying, I'm not sure if it applies to any other countries, but the saying goes that when the United States coughs, Australia catches the cold. So we have our influence. There's a fair bit of influence from America in the Australian experience. Yeah, but it's true, right? Yeah. So, but yeah, in terms of just talking about Kennedy in relation to Australia, obviously his death meant the escalation of the Vietnam War, and that's when Australia's own stake rose significantly as well. But we're not a country without our own little quirks and conspiracies. We had a prime minister, which is our head of state, take a swim in the ocean I think it was Christmas Day in 1967, and he disappeared. No one knows what, still to this day, no one knows what happened to him. That was Harold Holt, and Lyndon Johnson came all the way down to Australia for the funeral. So, we're a country that, is very much attached to Australia. But I would say from a media perspective, very similar to what Scott was saying. I mean, where I am in Perth, we have a company that owns both newspapers, the two biggest newspapers in the state, and also one of the television networks. So it's very corporatized, very, very skewed, and very, very political agenda driven as well. So I can definitely relate to what Scott was saying. We're very similar in that regard as well.
Rich, separation between conspiracy and fantasy.
Well, if you want to reduce document 1035-960 to a soundbite, I came up with one. Conspiracy theories are caused by conspiracies. That's what that document is saying. That's only a few words, but you can really spend a lot of time wrapping your mind around that. The key to it is that a conspiracy is a thing. A conspiracy theory is when you're trying to figure out the conspiracy. Conspiracies happen every day. They're tried in court every day. We've got them going on right now, even national cases going on right now in the courts are conspiracies. You'll hear them drop the word even when they're talking about the case and the trial. So conspiracies are a thing. They're a real thing. And that's the definition of a conspiracy. Now, if it's not a conspiracy, and you determine that by the evidence, if there's no evidence for it, it's not a conspiracy. So you have to have another word for that. Now, there are so the word I came up with, the best word I came up with was fantasy. A fantasy is something where there's no evidence for it at all. It's just a story you tell that has no basis to it at all. Most comic books, most superheroes are like that. They're fables, they're myths, they're nice, fun stories. Fables. I considered all of those words, but the best umbrella word is fantasy. If there's no evidence, it's a fantasy. It's not a conspiracy. It's not even a conspiracy theory. It's a fantasy. So, but when you have evidence, and here's the thing, in court, the burden of proof for a conspiracy is circumstantial because you never know everything about a conspiracy. The only way you can know anything about a conspiracy, and law enforcement will tell you this, criminology will tell you this. You read the best criminology textbooks, and it's there. You take criminal science in college, and it's there. You have to infiltrate a conspiracy to get information about it, because by definition, it's secret. And the good conspiracies are super secret. And so if you're lucky if you even catch one conspirator, one low-level conspirator. But once you do, you have the conspiracy. And you hope that that low-level guy leads you to other guys. But that's the criminology of conspiracies. And that's the difference between a conspiracy and a fantasy. Conspiracy theory is not a fantasy. Conspiracy theory is you trying to figure out the evidence for the conspiracy. So there's that.
I'm going to read this real quick because I had mentioned it earlier, but it's the Ronnie Duggar thing that I was talking about. It's an article that was posted, and it's saved by Harold Weisberg, but it's called "The Case is Not Closed." So it says Ronnie Duggar up here at the top. It says the facts about the assassination of President Kennedy have not been established, the case is not closed. Whether or not its main conclusion is eventually accepted, the Warren Report is a disgrace into history. To read it critically is to catalog its deficiencies. It is an exercise in the selection and presentation of evidence to make a preconceived conclusion sound as plausible as possible to those without the time and resources to study the evidence for themselves. Now, keep in mind, this is 1966. But from the first night after the murder, the spokesmen of the government were declaring that Oswald acted alone and had no accomplices. Those of us who were there well know this and can prove it any time we need to. It is also a manifest fact that no investigation could have conclusively established the complex facts of the historic crime before the weekend was out. Yet it was the government line from the very first that Oswald acted alone. It was therefore a shock to thoughtful Americans as it became clear that the Warren Report is not only a brief for the prosecution of Oswald, but also a slanted argument against the possibilities that he had accomplices. Precisely because this is true, the first assassination books that have had a conclusive impact has been J. Epstein's Inquest. It seems clear to me that Epstein could not have written his book without assistance. I don't know what that says. From dissatisfied persons from the Warren Commission's inner circle. Epstein establishes to the satisfaction, in my opinion, of any reasonable person who had studied, obviously, and in this literature, the Warren Commission faced with a choice between a responsible and open-minded investigation and an investigation designed to preserve the image of the country and its challenged government agencies chose by various processes the latter course. Now, I think that's important. I think it gives a really good take on the assassination, much as like we've all described, and that was in 1966. So now Ronnie Duggar was part of the Texas Observer. He helped establish and create the Texas Observer, but he's still alive. So anybody wants to reach out to him and get a statement from him, I don't know if he's speaking about the assassination, but I wanted to kind of bring it to the Jack Ruby shooting and kind of the maybe leads that probably should have been pursued. I mean, we had a number of new reporters there as well, too, in the basement at the time when Jack Ruby was shot. That's why we have a lot of people that could not identify Jack Ruby. Now, there's a lot of officers that knew Jack Ruby that were said that they didn't know Jack Ruby, which we found out was a lie. That is very, very true. But there's also people that talked about Jack Ruby helping out with camera equipment across the street. There's also threatening phone calls during that whole weekend with Oswald, threats to whether it was Billy Graham's statement about Jack Ruby, which Paul doesn't necessarily believe, but there's documented threats towards Oswald's life. And the importance of this kind of conversation here is the Dallas police prioritizing what the media needs to hear before they act, or what their responsibility is to the person that they have in their custody. It was a big thing with Jesse Curry making statements to the press. It's what got him wrung out by J. Edgar Hoover through a memo. And then also Brad, in a little bit, once Paul gets done speaking, I'd like to talk about some of the media at Parkland as well, too. Mostly dealing with, obviously, they put that bubble top on quickly when it came to the Parkland incidents. And a lot of that can be chalked up to they didn't want people taking photographs of it. Now, you want to say blocking evidence is one thing, but there's a real conscious mind to pay attention to what the media is going to get. We see that later with Jackie Kennedy not letting certain people see archive material, only Cyril Wecht later on. There's a big privacy factor where I think even with the conspiracy, the Kennedy family has as much to answer about this stuff as well, too, because there's a lot of research that could have been done that has been neglected for so many years because of the privacy or just the silence on the subject in general. So, Paul, take us away, and Brad will head into that topic.
I'd probably just say that the connection between the Dallas police and the media was systemic. So what you were referring to, Robbie, I've got it here in front of me. I'm going to read it. It's very, very brief. Chief Curry set in place General Order Number 81, which decreed that members of this department, so something that he actually sent out, would render every assistance except such as obviously may seriously hinder or delay the proper functioning of the department to the accredited members of the official news gathering agencies. And this includes newspaper, television, cameramen, and newsreel photographers. So he put that out. That was a statement, I don't know exactly when, I think it was 1961, saying basically the Dallas police were acting as a PR arm. They were using the media as their PR arm. There was very much you lean on me, lean on you. They wanted the media to show them in a good light, and obviously the price for that was access. And boy, do we know that the media had very good access across City Hall. that weekend, the moment Oswald was brought in. But probably the thing that I could really back that up with is the proportion of media to Dallas police at the time of Oswald shooting in the basement. That's one area that I go into a great deal in my book, accounting for not just the where police officers were standing at the junction of the ramps in the basement there, but where a lot of the media were. For me, that was a big learning. I didn't know that. I just took it that there was the 10 or so reporters that the Dallas police acknowledged or interviewed in their investigation, but I count 46 as being in the immediate vicinity. So as far back as not even beyond their jail office and in the immediate area of the garage ramps junctions. So if that's correct, that's a 50-50 ratio, a head count of as many reporters as there were Dallas police for this, what was meant to be a secure. And, the Dallas police did go to great lengths to say that they'd secured and sealed the basement and made sure they did so with in front of the eyes of some reporters. But it was far from that. And of course, we had Chief Curry, Jesse Curry, saying that, telling the reporters apparently that if they were back, the next morning at 10 a.m., they won't have missed the transfer. Interestingly, adding to that, some reporters said that he specifically said the transfer would happen at 10 a.m. So it wasn't even that, ambiguous. Well, just come back for 10 o'clock and you won't have missed anything. But even on the morning of Oswald shooting at 10:20, he was holding court up on the third floor, laying out exactly how the transfer would take place, giving just a complete blueprint, the plans. He would be taken down in the elevator. He would be transported to county jail in an armoured car. One reporter even found out the name of the armoured car service that was being used. Curry was just laying out all the details for the media. And he even had the gall to say that, we could have transferred Oswald the night before because we had some threats come in, but I didn't do it because I promised you, media, that the transfer would take place when I said it would. So it's just absolutely unreal. We all don't need to going to go too much into Curry and his.
We see that at like 4 a.m. when Bill Decker's requesting to transfer Lee Harvey Oswald, but then they're like, hold on, we have to find out about Curry. But then Curry took his phone off the hook, which I get it. Look, man, that's probably a rough weekend. Just go to bed, dude. Just not want to answer those calls.
Look, absolutely. But the call went to Fritz first. Frazier called Fritz, and Fritz said, no, that's not my call. Curry's handling the transfer. It's his call. And so that was, and obviously I couldn't, the phone line wasn't working. But I don't think Curry would have made any changes regardless if they were able to reach him in time.
And another thing, we talk about assumption of guilt here, media late. And before we get into the Parkland stuff, I think Scott can speak on this as well, too, with the Walker shooting. But the media was, even from Charles T. Walker's testimony, when they're covering Oswald's face as he's being pulled out of the theater, we have people screaming at Oswald, kill him, hang him, because they're assuming that he was the killer of President Kennedy. And Charles T. Walker even states, we weren't charging him for killing Kennedy. We were charging him for killing a cop. We suspected him of killing a cop, but it seemed like the public thought or assumed that he was the guy who killed Kennedy. And then we see later interviews through hallways of what Oswald's being arrested for. And the one guy goes, did you get him for charging for killing the president? And he goes, no, we haven't got him on that. We're in here for a cop. You hear those statements that start to ring through where the public just started assuming things. A guy in handcuffs the same day. Well, why didn't they assume that with the other 3 that were arrested that day? There were 3 other suspects that were arrested that were released from custody when Oswald was arrested. So, okay, they have a description. Look at some of these people. They all match a skinny kid, kind of similar looking to Oswald. I think it's Donald Wainhouse or David Wainhouse that looks almost exactly like Lee Harvey Oswald. And we have footage of that as well, too. But even with the Walker shooting, it was never defined as Oswald did it. It was never even there was way other more suspects, but the media just tacks that on now. Where it's like you see things now, oh, we know he killed Kennedy because he killed General Walker. It's like, really? Because that wasn't proven. But if you don't know, you don't read the report, and you're just looking at the headline, then the media plays a giant factor in the presumptions of guilt there. Scott, that would be you.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, when it came to General Walker, I mean, the media didn't really do much about the Walker shooting immediately after it happened. They reported it, and then they basically moved on to other things. I think there was might have been an American nuclear submarine might have had an accident the day of the Walker shooting or the day after the Walker shooting. It probably diverted their attention, but nonetheless, they didn't really investigate that. And when Oswald was then fingered as being the person who had shot President Kennedy in their eyes, suddenly they got a bit of an interest in the Walker case because it obviously kind of made sense. Well, he's got a propensity for political assassination, but even then they didn't really investigate the case. They didn't go and speak to the witnesses, the very few that were that they could have, like Kirk Coleman, who heard the shot and saw two men leaving from the alley, getting into two separate cars and leaving the scene. I mean, he's an important witness in the Walker shooting, but really has flown under the radar for 60 years. And again, the newspapers, etc., didn't really seem to take much of an interest in him or the evidence that he was able to bring. So it's just another example of the media not doing their job, not being inquisitive enough, not asking the right questions, and just going along with the narrative that has been determined for them.
Brad, I want you to speak about some of the media at Parkland. Just a heads up, guys. After this, I'm going to get you guys' perspectives on the after part of the assassination. I don't have more than like 3 hours to do this. I know we all got things to do. So, Brad, if you want to speak about the kind of the media at Parkland, the kind of consciousness of paying attention that there was media there and to cover up a lot of things that could be, I don't know, private.
Well, yeah, the press bus obviously arrived within a few minutes of the limousine, and then you get things like the bucket photo showing up with the bucket outside the limousine, and they're interviewing the father who administered last rites to President Kennedy. I don't know why a priest is able to give an interview like that. They interviewed Senator Yarborough. But the real problem was the press conference that Perry and Clark had given in a classroom upstairs about an hour after Kennedy was declared dead. That was filmed, and you can find film of that, but it's silent film. The Secret Service, when they were visiting the hospital and the various news outlets in the days following that, confiscated the audio. Fortunately, through the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library, they have White House transcript 1327C, which was taken by a White House stenographer during that press conference. And even though we don't have their voices giving the answers, we have the transcripts. And in that, they're describing injuries that come from the front. What the Secret Service didn't do as far as managing to scare people, and they did scare a number of people that Sunday when they came around and said, hey, you guys need to not talk about this ever again. Dr. Charles Baxter, who was one of the three attendings present, he mentioned to everyone, if you speak of this and make any money off of this deal, personally, I will see to it that your career in medicine is ruined. So not only do we have a media blackout imposed by the Secret Service, but we also have a threat from a senior physician. Baxter just claimed that he was patriotic and did that on his own. Parkland, those folks didn't really do too much. I think a couple of them talked to Mark Lane, and then later, they got into things a lot more in depth with Lift and maybe Tink Thompson. But, for a lot of years, they pretty much said, if you want to know what we saw, you need to go to volume 6 of the Warren Commission hearings. There is an appendix in the Warren Commission report itself, which contains their mission notes, and they relied on those things to do their talk for them. In 1992, in April, Dr. Charles Crenshaw came out with a book called JFK Conspiracy of Silence, which did receive a bit of notoriety. He was on 2020, he was on 60 Minutes, he was on various programs of that sort. And immediately, because I had interviewed several of the physicians prior to that as a high school student, so they didn't think that that was going anywhere. So they would speak with me. They'd spoken with Lifton, they'd spoken with Harry Livingston and people like that. Crenshaw's book began to take quite a beating in the media, largely because the major news outlets, UPI and AP, picked up criticism of the book from some of the folks that were there. Ken Sawyer among them, Charles Baxter. May 27th, 1992, the Journal of the American Medical Association published the first 2 of a 3-part series on the Kennedy assassination. 2 of those dealt with the autopsy. One of them dealt with people who were in the trauma room at the time. Now, the Journal of the American Medical Association is a fairly esoteric journal for the average person to be reading. Nevertheless, that got picked up in the media. Dr. Crenshaw began taking some flack. That's about the time that I got to know him a little bit, and he filed a suit against the Journal of the American Medical Association, the American Medical Association, their editor, George Lundberg, their writer, Dennis Brio, and a number of others. And he just wanted equal time. He wrote an article with his attorney, Brad Kazaya, called Let's Set the Record Straight. Well, I had a large number of interviews and correspondence that was fresh from these doctors. We're talking 1992, 1993. I believe it was 94 when the lawsuit was filed. And I provided that to the Crenshaw legal team, and I continued to do digging as I could on their behalf. I was kind of a volunteer on that. And the suit was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount of money. One of the terms was the Journal of the American Medical Association had to publish Dr. Crenshaw's rebuttal. In a sense, there were several physicians there who implied that everything Crenshaw said was a lie. He wasn't even there. It's since been proven. He's mentioned in Warren 6 as being there. In my mind, he was redeemed. He issued a second book called Trauma Room 1, which was written with the assistance of, various articles. It's kind of a collection of articles, but that was written with the assistance of Gary Aguilar, Cyril Wecht, Brad Kazaya, people like that, physicians with serious credentials. And after that kind of blew over, the media went back to treating anyone who spoke out against the official version as being kind of this kooky person. Now, I knew Dr. Crenshaw very well. I met with him several times. In fact, we were talking about the hat in Fort Worth earlier. And the very first time I met Dr. Crenshaw at the Fort Worth Petroleum Club, what did he present me with? A Texas Stetson hat. But you could sit across the table from the gentleman, and whether he was right or he was wrong, you knew that he believed what he was saying. He felt that the American people had a right to know what he had seen and heard and was a part of. and I tend to agree with them. A lot of people think I'm naive in that for being on kind of the Crenshaw bandwagon, but they didn't know him, and I did. I was honored to work on that lawsuit, and I was glad that he, in his own way, was redeemed. But that was the only real flare up of Parkland coverage since the assassination itself, really. And then after that, it of course died out, and Dr. Crenshaw passed away several years later.
Can I ask Brad a question? Brad, what do you know about this Johnson receiving Crenshaw receiving a phone call from Lyndon Johnson
I
about
know. I
Lee
mentioned
Oswald?
that to him too, Scott.
Is
Yeah,
that
he mentions it in the Men Killed Kennedy documentary.
Yeah, that plays heavily in both books. There was Dr. Thomas Shires, who was chief of surgery, who was in Galveston on the day that Kennedy was shot, but he was there when Oswald was brought in. Dr. Charles Baxter, Robert McClelland, Paul Peters, I believe, was there. Malcolm Perry was there. Dr. Charles Crenshaw. They're all in the operating suite attending to Oswald. They noticed that there are two guys. Dr. Peters discusses this specifically in The Men Who Killed Kennedy. Two guys dressed in, as they termed, surgical garb, but they're not people that they recognize. In the meantime, a call comes in wanting to talk to Dr. Shires. This call is taken at the Parkland switchboard by an operator named Phyllis Bartlett, whom I've met through Dr. Crenshaw's attorney. Very credible woman. She recalls Lyndon Johnson calling the White House or calling Parkland. Well, when it's patched through to the operating suite, who's the low man on the totem pole? Who's the most expendable guy to leave the room to take this call? Because in their minds, a call, even from the president at that moment, is not really a priority. They've got their hands full with their patient. So Dr. Crenshaw is selected to step over into the ante room and take the phone call. During that call, Dr. Crenshaw said that Lyndon Johnson asked him, "How is the accused assassin doing?" And he said, "Well, he's lost a lot of blood. He's holding his own, but it's too early to tell. It could go either way." And he said, "I've got two gentlemen in the emergency or in the operating room ready to take a deathbed confession, and you will see to it that that happens." This was not a request. This was a standard Lyndon Johnson tactic. This was an order. But when you've got a guy who is in the shape that Oswald was in, that didn't occur. Dr. Peters in The Men Who Killed Kennedy kind of corroborates this statement by saying he recalled at one point one of the guys with a notepad and a pen down at Oswald's ear while the surgeons are working feverishly to try to patch this myriad of holes in every essential organ. But this guy is screaming in Oswald's ear, "Did you do it? Did you do it?" Which led everyone to believe they'd not gotten a deathbed confession. But that call was confirmed independently by the operator who put that call through.
I'm going to wrap up on a few things here, and then we're going to get into your just guys' opinions and perspectives while also promoting your guys' books for the work that you have done. I want to thank each individual one of you for giving me the time to do this today, and also all the conversations that we've had in the past 2 years. I've dived into the assassination and tried to learn as much as I possibly could about it. I do appreciate that. One thing I want to show right here is we've never really had, if there was publishing articles and stuff like that, or things that went against the official narrative, where people that technically owned the independent place, like I mentioned with Ronnie Duggar. But there's one person that really didn't own a news establishment, but did get a lot of things published. Now, they were very critique of him, but it was Jim Garrison. Jim Garrison had the power to bring people to court or subpoena people. I mean, you could say anybody can really do that, but he really was being very forward in his investigation. And one thing I wanted to share right here is an article or document And it states right here, Richard Townley, WDSU-TV, New Orleans, remarked to a special agent of the New Orleans office last evening that he had received instructions from NBC New York to prepare a 1-hour TV special on Jim Garrison with the instruction, quote, shoot him down. Now, not saying there was a red target in the shape of something on Jim Garrison's back. And maybe there was a Wile E. Coyote in the distance with some TNT. But there was obviously a targeted approach to handling Jim Garrison when it came to what he was investigating. And I think each individual researcher that I've spoken to and people, much like yourselves, that have done any bit of things about trying to work with getting something published, you guys have experienced your own kind of complications and difficulties. Now, I don't need examples from you guys, but if you guys could briefly share your perspective on what it's like to research, and also what it's like to talk or even publish any work that you have on the Kennedy assassination, whether it could be positive. I've seen articles recently change their, remarks about Lee Harvey Oswald now saying accused assassin, which I think is very important. Does that go any farther? No, not really, but still we're having a little bit more of the conversation turn. So now we won't see maybe as many hit pieces of the official narrative. But Paul, do you want to start off, and then we'll go in the order that we started with Randy, Rich, Scott, and then Brad?
With my work on the Oswald shooting, it was I didn't set out to write a book. I just found myself getting deeper and deeper into the statements. Firstly, through from the DPD investigation, then the FBI, then the Warren Commission. I followed the trail, and I couldn't believe the amount of narratives that to me, and they were opening up, and I would start to try and follow them and see if anyone else had picked up on these things that I had, and I could. Apart from the too many of the fringe elements when it comes to the Oswald shooting, really not much out there. So I just really kept following until even the HSCA probably gave the most comprehensive focus in its report on the Oswald shooting, and even then that only went so far. So for me, it was just very much following a process, and I got to a point where I was able to kind of put some order to it, and in the shape of a manuscript, and I didn't even think once about trying to take it to publishers. I thought I had something worth sharing with serious researchers, and basically, shining light on an area of the case that really ought to have more ought to have had more light shined on it ever since. And I think the connections between the Oswald shooting and obviously what happened on November 22nd are very clear. And I think even the passage of time doesn't have to be an all ruling factor in preventing us from still finding out bits of the truth. So that to me is what's most important. The book, the outcome, publishing a book is almost secondary. I'm still in the process of researching it. I'll keep going as well. So I've got it out on Kindle and paperback. So through your online outlets, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Powell's, yeah.
Yeah, so my I had an early lesson in how this work would be received. So I finished film school in the late 90s, and I had started my initial research and my avocation in the JFK assassination and larger deep political issues. But my first film out of film school, I sold to the Independent Film Channel. They purchased it. It got a lot of momentum and did really well, and it made them money. And the head of acquisitions at IFC said, give me first look on your next picture. We're really interested and want to work with you. And, as right out of film school, this was really exciting. And had a meeting with him in New York, and he said, okay, so what do you got next? And I said, well, I want to make this film about the JFK assassination. And he just paused and said, okay, what else you got? And that was it. That was the beginning of my realization, like, oh, this is how it really works. And this was amazing to me because my film made them money. So I'd already proven that I could, make something that could maybe make them more money. And it was just amazing to me that even in the capitalist society that system we have, that even that the prospect of making money they wouldn't even consider it. And that was very instructive for me. And that's one reason that The Searchers took me so long to finish. It was all self-funded. So save money, buy gear, go on interviews, come back, save money. And so, yeah, that's kind of been my path. And that was a really solid early lesson I got. And it's a lesson that every researcher I've spoken to over the years, they have very similar stories.
And where can people find The Searchers?
My website, thesearchersfilm.com. Everything and anything about my work in deep politics is there.
Rich.
The Searchers. Someone has to seek the truth is his motto. And I've got the box set with the uncut interviews, something else you can't get anymore. So, my story is very accessible. I wrote the introduction to my book is My Small World of JFK Conspiracy. That intro is on my Substack, so you can read my big essay about that. But I want to tell you the reason I chose Gordon McClendon to talk about here, and I've only got like 10.
Can you wrap it in 5 minutes? Because I cannot upload a file that's 3 hours long to Spotify.
I definitely can, because KLIF was my radio station.
Well, then get to it, boy. Let's go.
All right. Gordon McClendon. All the guys we've talked about were my local news guys. Wes Wise, we didn't mention Wes Wise. He became mayor of Dallas. But I knew him as he was my weatherman. We watched his weather every night. Anyway, so I grew up with these guys. I didn't have to learn about him later in some book. Gordon McClendon, you heard his name because he was the owner of KLIF. He was a pioneer in Top 40 radio. Everything we know is Top 40 radio he invented with KLIF. Started in 47 in Oak Cliff. He was born in 21, so he was 42 at the time of the assassination. He denied knowing Ruby to the HSCA, but Ruby listed him among his 6 closest friends. Often visiting KLIF and calling him at home. And he even did all of that on the day of the assassination. And he set up interviews between the police and KLIF reporters, just like he did with Ike Pappas, we were mentioning earlier. He was a national radio pioneer and mogul. He owned lots of stations. He owned TV stations. He was in the film business. He owned drive-in theaters. The one I went to all the time with my girlfriends, right down the street from me, he owned.
He also worked with David Atlee Phillips at a point.
He was a friend of David Atlee Phillips. I'm getting to that. His father-in-law, Gordon McClellan's father-in-law, was a guy named James A. No. He was a former Louisiana governor, an oil magnate, and he was a partner in the oil business with Governor Huey Long. Their oil company was called Win or Lose Oil, and it had a bunch of scandals. It was a little corrupt oil company. In World War II, Gordon McClendon was ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence. He was a Japanese translator, so he was intelligence. He applied to the CIA. He claimed he was turned down. That's standard operating procedure. If you get on the phone with the CIA today and you say, I want to apply to the CIA, they'll tell you on the phone, tell all your friends we turned you down. It happened to a friend of mine. That's how I know. But he ran a business in Japan in the 50s while the CIA was launching a major covert op to prop up a right-wing party to oppose a left-wing party. The right-wing party eventually ruled Japan for a generation after that. But McClendon's CIA files are still sealed. 1960, he owned Radio Nord, an offshore pirate radio station. He pioneered this also with his close friend Clint Murkison. The station manager of that station had CIA links. The CIA and Radio Nord is an article in Lobster Magazine from 2020. I found that out. He was a friend of David Atlee Phillips, whom he assisted in establishing clandestine pro-democracy broadcasting stations in Latin America. Altogether, the CIA and the Cuban exiles operated about 40 stations in 5 countries around the Caribbean, and McClendon helped them do that. Now, he was a rabid anti-communist. He ran in 1964 in the Democratic primary race against, guess who? Ralph Yarborough. They were trying to get rid of Ralph Yarborough in 64 after they had already killed the Democratic Party. But they ran Gordon McClendon against him in 64. He got 43% of the vote. In the late 60s, he ran in 68 in the primary for Texas governor. Didn't get anywhere.
You know, I
As
can
a
do a separate
filmmaker-
episode on Gordon McClendon, right? Like I can have.
Yeah. Somebody needs to do a book on McClendon. You could do it in a book.
That's what I'm
and a film
saying.
on
We don't
just
need to talk
McClendon
about
alone.
him on this unless you get to the media part to it. But I don't want a biography about the guy.
Yeah, well, he was the media. He was my media. He was the media. He's in the Radio Hall of Fame. Last point. He created a pro-CIA TV series in 1978 with Fred Weintraub, producer Fred Weintraub, and they pitched it. He did it. He did it because he couldn't stand the film 3 Days of the Condor. He said, we need some positive stuff on the CIA. So they developed a TV series. They pitched it. He and Atlee Phillips pitched it to director Stansfield Turner, CIA director Stansfield Turner, in March 78, and nothing came of it. So that's Gordon McClendon.
I'm writing it
That's-
down. We'll do a topic on that one. All right. It seems like you got a lot of.
Well, that's all I know. I researched this for this podcast. But
that
I've
wasn't
learned
what
that
I sent though. I sent 5 things pro and 5 things against with the media. And you're telling me that's what you
that was-
wrote out of the thing I told you to write?
Gordon McClendon was one of my 3 things that
Rich.
I picked. I gave you the other 2 earlier.
All right. That's fine. Now you did
We
good.
didn't even get into South by Southwest media panel that got me started in all this.
Oh.
So anyway, back to what got me started in all this. Yeah, South by Southwest media panel and all that. That's all in my essay. So that's me. Gordon McClendon was a huge thing in my life growing up as a kid. From my earliest years.
I will mark you down for the episode we do on Gordon McClendon. I'm fine with doing that because he is a large area and there's a lot to touch on there that wasn't mentioned. But so your Substack and then the Center for Deep Political Research, I will link in the description for people can find Rich's links. Scott, give me your links. Brad, please I know where your book's located as well too, but give me your links too, and then we'll try and wrap this in like 3 minutes. Right? Let's do it.
Myself, I mean, I was just really somebody who, from a young age, was just interested in the Kennedy assassination. When you live in Glasgow in Scotland, there's nobody else really that interested, but for some reason it got my interest at a young age. And really all I was doing was reading the books, watching the documentaries, like most people do. And but it started to, I think the 50th anniversary of the assassination, I went back to Dallas. And that really kind of ignited my interest again, although I'd never really gone away, but that really got it back. And I really was going back every year since. And I started to think, look, there must be something that you can actually do your own research, do your own writing. And that's when I came across William Duff, the Scotsman who worked for General Walker and was a suspect in the Walker shooting. So I thought, well, that's interesting. This is a guy that was born only about 20 miles away from where I was born. And he's over in Dallas in 1963. He's working for General Walker. This is interesting. So I kind of dug into him quite a bit. And Randy, you gave me some really good encouragement. So thank you. And I wrote an article about him and got it printed in the Garrison magazine. That when you investigate William Duff, that really does get you into the Walker shooting. So I have written a chapter for Steve Cameron's book, which I hope will be coming out at some point. A chapter on the Walker shooting. But there's more to do on Duff. I mean, I find that I go down dead ends. I'm looking for people to get back to me, and they don't get back to me for whatever reason. So you've just got to try and persevere. And then a couple of other little things that were actually Scottish related that I've written about in the Kennedys and King website and talked about at DP UK conferences, presentations that you can get on the YouTube channel. So I don't know if it's going to be a book or not. I'm a bit like Paul. I mean, I don't do these things with the intention of writing a book, but I do have a little Tartan trilogy, if you like, with Duff, the Kirk Newton incident, which is a place just outside Edinburgh. There's a little connection there to the Kennedy assassination, and a talk I did 2 weeks ago at the DP UK conference in Canterbury. Again, there's a little kind of Scottish connection. So I'm just going to try and find the time to dig away as much as I can on each of those little stories and try and find out more, bring out more. And will there ever be a book? Probably not, but I'm sure Paul said that as well when he gets started. So we'll see where it goes. But Garrison Magazine, Kennedys and King, and the Dealey Plaza UK YouTube channel, people will find links to those articles and presentations that I've given.
Call it Revenge of the Duff or Duff Strikes Back if you make a book. I tossed out some titles to Paul. He didn't accept any of them. Well, they were really good. Only fans, only Ruby, about the Ruby shooting. The Oswald shooting? That would be nuts. That's a good one. Your title was better anyway. Brad, let's get to you on your links and then we'll...
Okay, the Cliff Notes version of the Reader's Digest edition. I got into it in the early to mid 90s. I got witness statements from, giving me numbers of shots that were all over the map. So I went to the doctors. The doctors are trained observers, and that's where I focused. And I'm purely interested in Parkland Hospital. Even the autopsy doesn't hold that much interest. My book was largely the brainchild of Deborah Conway. You got to remember in the days that came out, about 2002, 2003, we did not have the internet as developed as it is now. So there's a lot of documents such as White House transcript 1327C. There's some depositions. There's some testimony of different kinds in the back of that book. The book is on Kindle, which I was appalled at the format on because the charts that I had in there did not translate well. It's also available on a CD-ROM from JFK Lancer. And on the CD, you get the ebook. But more importantly than that, the reason to get the CD is that it has an hour and it has me introducing, and then Dr. Ron Jones, who was at Parkland, giving an hour and a half talk. So you get to hear from the man himself. And those are the links, and that's the shortest version I could give you, Robbie.
I appreciate that. That was actually really good. Thank you, everybody, for doing the podcast. Like I said, again, sorry, 2 hours is usually limit on Spotify, and we're damn near pushing 3. Anyone's complaining that it wasn't long enough. All right, okay. You do the editing, and you contact me because it's not easy, okay? But I do appreciate the time, guys, and this discussion, this JFK panel number 5 here, was on the discussion of the media in relation to the Kennedy assassination, either before, during, or after. You can check out any of these researchers' independent works in the links below. I recommend it. Please do. Rich's Substack's pretty good. He's got a lot of good writings on there if you want to get into the deep part of Texas. Look at that. I threw out a book title as well, too. I'm really good at promoting my own links, and I'm not going to talk for too much longer because I complained about cutting it short. But thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode.